do it. Good morning and welcome, and I'm very sorry we're 8 minutes late, but we do appreciate this panel being with us this morning. We look forward to your testimony as we have this hearing on the effects of Middle East events on U.S. energy markets. We convened today's hearing to have a discussion on recent developments in the Middle East and North Africa and their effect on world energy markets. Violent protests and political uncertainty in Egypt 2 weeks ago caused a sudden spike in oil prices that over the past few days has gradually subsided. The price increase was driven by investor fears over the possible shutdown of the Suez Canal and Summit pipeline, which transport up to 3 million barrels of oil per day. These events provide a catalyst for deeper examination of the economic and geopolitical factors that contribute to the pricing of oil and its impact on the United States. Events in the Middle East also demonstrate a number of facts. One, oil is a globally traded commodity, the price of which is influenced by basic laws of supply and demand. Two, political events do play a major role on influencing the price of oil. And three, half the world's oil is produced in OPEC member states and Russia. Some of these nations are politically and economically unstable, and in a tightening market, unreliable sources of oil will prove increasingly detrimental to price stability and international security. It also certainly reinforces the issue of the importance of Canada and our relationship with Canada as it relates to energy. With these facts in mind, we should turn our attention to the current state of international energy markets. We have a booming demand in China, which greatly outpaces that of the OECD countries. We've seen in 2008 how OPEC spare capacity can reach dangerously low levels during periods of high global demand. We have new frontiers of oil production ranging from the Arctic to enhanced recovery technologies here in the U.S. Additionally, we have restricted vast supplies here in North America by government action or, in many cases, government inaction. I should say we have restricted vast supplies due to government action or inaction. Now, how do all of these factors relate to domestic energy policy? For starters, there are numerous steps we can take to protect ourselves from price and supply shocks. The National Petroleum Council estimates we have upwards of 40 billion barrels of oil locked away in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic, and Pacific coast, on and offshore Alaska, that are currently off limits for production. These 40 billion barrels are double the proven reserves in the U.S. today. These resources could easily double our domestic production capacity and replace our imports from the Middle East. This is the quickest and most efficient way of reducing dependence on foreign sources and ensuring environmental safety. Any barrel we do not produce here in the U.S. or Canada will have to be produced in a remarkably less safe, less regulated, and more environmentally damaging manner in Nigeria, Venezuela, Angola, and other states where environmental quality is a depressingly low priority. Essentially, failing to produce domestic energy guarantees environmental harm elsewhere in the world. Events in Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Algeria, and Yemen show how uncertain and dangerous this world is. Furthermore, these developments show how the price of oil can bend to the will of protesters thousands of miles away from our shores. How we react and adapt to these inconvenient reality is a test of political leadership that will play a major role in the economic and national security of America. And that's why we are so appreciative of all of you being here, and we look forward to your testimony. And with that, I'll recognize the gentleman from Illinois for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for their presence here today, and I want to thank you for holding today's hearing to highlight our nation's growing need to address our energy security and to improve our energy independence. Energy supply and demand are key components to the American economy. They affect all dimensions of our lives, from driving to work, feeding our families, to heating and cooling our homes. Notwithstanding energy's fundamental importance, the markets and exchanges on which our energy sources are traded remain extremely volatile and unpredictable. I think I can safely say that a consistent theme we will be hearing throughout this morning is that it is in America's best strategic and economic interest to become less and less dependent on foreign oil, gas, and other fossil fuels in a shorter time frame as possible. The Obama administration understands this perfectly well, which is why it has set the ambitious goals of, 1, putting 1 million electric automobiles on America's streets, highways, and into American families' garages and parking lots by 2012. 2, unleashing a clean energy revolution to double the supply of renewable energy by the end of 2012. 3, doubling America's exports by the end of 2015. And 4, dramatically decreasing American dependence on traditional fossil fuels so that by 2035, approximately 80% of America's electricity is sourced by renewables. That is also why the Obama administration is putting our country on a prudent course to disrupt our existing paradigms and business models, which yield insufficient energy reliability and efficiency, disastrous environmental consequences, and lackluster competitiveness in international trade. Rather, the new paradigm focuses on making substantial public investments and designing incentives to encourage major private investments, as well as leveraging speedier deployments of advanced electric and smart grid technologies and networks. In past sessions of Congress, we have set policies aimed at achieving this. We've lowered dependency on volatile world oil markets by reducing our appetite for oil and gas. Under Congress's direction and the stewardship of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the EPA, we have made sufficient and significant progress towards improving our nation's energy efficiency. But our dependency as individuals, families, and businesses on imported energy sources is still far too great. Allow me to commend you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this timely hearing, especially as we are in the midst of winter with record-breaking low temperatures and snowfalls in many parts of the country, including my own city and state, while at the same time our lagging economy imposes added pressures on America's budgets, especially those of the unemployed and the working poor. I must say that regardless of the policy choices that will be made by this administration or this Congress, our low-income families must always be offered and given needed assistance to cook and heat their homes in winter. I have been a staunch supporter and advocate for the crusade for and led by the effort in Congress to fully fund LIHEAP at $5.1 billion in FY 2010 and to increase access and eligibility for low-income families, the elderly, and seniors all over the country. However, I am very disappointed and disturbed that the administration, in proposing this FY 2012 budget, plans to reduce LIHEAP by roughly $3.1 billion. This will amount to a steep cut in funding from $5.1 billion, at which the program had been funded for the past 2 years. This is just unacceptable to me and to others. Today's hearing should be used, Mr. Chairman, to criticize EPA's permitting process to build refineries or to sanction more domestic drilling. In case you have forgotten, let me remind you that EPA's mission, as the name indicates, is to protect the American environment and the country that we inhabit. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you so much. My time is concluded, and I yield back whatever balance of time that I have.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. And at this time, I recognize our Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Barton of Texas. 5 minutes.
I'm only going to use 1 minute, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, we had a hearing on a domestic issue, the Environmental Protection Agency, and its effort to regulate the U.S. economy through the regulations of regulating greenhouse gases. It's a very important issue domestically. Today, we're focusing internationally, situation in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt, its impact on energy markets. I think it's safe to say that in a global economy, unrest in the Middle East with the Suez Canal and the political situation, not just in Egypt but in a number of the Islamic countries, should give the United States pause. I think it points out the fact that quite plainly that we need to develop our domestic energy resources. I was heartened to hear President Obama in his State of the Union talk about natural gas and clean energy. We don't have a lack of energy resources in this country, Mr. Chairman. We do have a lack of political consensus on how and if to develop them. Hopefully this hearing will build the case that it's time to move forward domestically. I noticed we have a former member, Mr. John. I'm sure he's going to talk about the situation in the Gulf of Mexico and the de facto moratorium on new exploration there. So with that, I appreciate the hearing, and I would like to yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm a Obama skeptic when it comes to energy security. We have the resources available to be in North American energy supplies to be energy independent. When we talk about North American, it's great to see my friend Chris John here. He'll talk about the permatorium. And when the economy starts recovering and gas prices reach $4.50, $5 a gallon, we're going to ask, why does this administration continue to delay, obstruct oil and gas exploration in the Gulf? And then, and I'm very pleased to see Mr. Marr here on the Canadian oil sands. You know, this administration, pending with the State Department, permission to obviously to bring the oil down to continental United States. In his testimony in Appendix A, it talks about jobs. Yesterday was about jobs. There's no bigger job creator in the state of Illinois right now than this pipeline and the direction straight to the Wood River Refinery, which is right outside my district. $2 billion pipeline, $2 billion expansion of a refinery. The jobs, of course, another great Illinois company, Caterpillar, is being used extensively up there. We're talking, again, the increase in jobs between 2009 to 2025 of 26,000 jobs. Folks, that's been my message consistently over the past 5 years about the high-paying, good jobs in the fossil fuel industry that the past Congresses and this administration continue to want to destroy. And so as we look and have this testimony, we're talking about the threat of constrained crude oil based upon the geopolitical world. This would not be as much of a dangerous situation if we accessed our resources in the Gulf, if we accessed our resources with our Canadian friends, allies, and if we don't do this pipeline, that pipeline could go west, and guess where? To China, which is part of our debate yesterday, whether we want to create jobs in China or whether we want to create jobs in the United States. I'm very excited about this hearing. I appreciate all the panelists in attendance, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. This time I recognize Mr. Waxman of California, the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Recent events in Egypt have once again exposed our dependence on foreign oil. Although Egypt isn't a major producer of oil, the Suez Canal and the Suez-Mediterranean pipeline are crucial shipping links for global oil and gas markets. Instability there has increased oil prices around the world. For years, decades really, the Energy Information Administration projected that U.S. oil consumption would grow year after year, and it did. By 2005, nearly 60% of U.S. fuels were imported. 60% is imported, and the future looked bleak. Higher oil consumption and more imports far into the future. The solution offered by the Bush administration was to drill our way out of the problem, and I know we're going to hear this proposed solution again today. We'll hear that increased domestic production is the answer. But more U.S. production is never going to be enough to appreciably reduce global oil prices or U.S. imports of foreign oil. We use 25% of the world's oil, but we only have 2% of the world's oil reserves. So we could double it, we could even triple it, and it's simply not going to affect global oil prices much. The key to making progress is to focus on how much oil we use. Reducing our share of global oil consumption from 25% can have a real impact both on global oil prices and on imports. The new motor vehicle standards promulgated by the Obama administration are Exhibit A for benefits of greater efficiency. In 2009, the administration brokered an agreement to provide the auto industry with coordinated fuel economy and greenhouse gas emission standards for model years 2012 through 2016. This effort was supported by the auto industry, the states, and environmental advocacy groups. The carbon pollution tailpipe standards have had a remarkable impact. This national program is projected to save 1.8 billion barrels of oil. The administration estimates that the standard yields net savings to consumers of roughly $130 to $180 per year and $3,000 over the life of the vehicle. Most remarkable is the impact of these standards on U.S. oil imports and consumption. As this chart shows on the screens, the Energy Information Administration now projects that we will be importing less oil in the future than we did in 2007, reversing decades of increasing reliance on foreign oil. And in a fundamental and historic shift, overall U.S. consumption of oil is predicted to stop growing. As a second chart shows, by requiring improvements in how efficiently we use oil, the administration has reversed a dangerous trend. The administration wants to build on this success with stronger standards after model year 2016, and it is also working on standards for trucks and other commercial vehicles. These standards could save even more money at the pump while further reducing our dependence on foreign oil. Incredibly, the new Republican majority in Congress is opposed to these efforts. Chairman Upton and Senator Inhofe have proposed legislation to block EPA from setting new motor vehicle standards. This subcommittee held a hearing on this bill yesterday. We need more energy independence, not less. We need more savings for consumers at the pump, not fewer. We need to use oil more efficiently so that we can import less of it. But the Upton-Inhofe bill would take us in exactly the wrong direction. It would block one policy that has proven that it works. The Upton-Inhofe bill is great for oil companies like Koch Industries, which spent millions of dollars electing Republicans, but it is a public health, economic, and national security disaster for all the rest of us. As we learn more today about the challenges of being dependent on oil from the Middle East, I hope all members will consider what is at stake. We're finally heading in the right direction. It would be a costly mistake to halt our progress. Yield back.
Thank you. At this time, we're going to ask our panel to give their opening statements, and we have with us this morning Mr. Richard Newell, who's Administrator of the Energy Information Administration. We have Mr. Gary Marr, Minister Counselor from the province of Alberta. We have Mr. Adam Saminsky, Chief Energy Economist, Deutsche Bank. We have Mr. Hofmeister, who is President of Citizens for Affordable Energy. We have Mr. Chris Busch, Director of Policy and Program, Apollo Alliance, and our former colleague, Mr. Chris John, President of the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association. So, Dr. Newell, I'll call upon you to begin with the opening statements. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. The Energy Information Administration is the statistical and analytical agency within the Department of Energy. EIA does not promote or take positions on policy issues and has independence with respect to the information and analysis we provide. Therefore, our views should not be construed as representing those of the Department of Energy or other federal agencies. Given Egypt's small role in the global supply-demand balance for both oil and natural gas, the primary issue for global energy markets is driven by two other concerns. First, there is the concern that unrest could spread to countries with a larger role in supplying world oil markets. There is no doubt that the Middle East and North Africa are a major source of oil supply and other petroleum liquids, supplying about 28% of global liquids consumption. At the same time, there is about 5% spare crude oil production capacity and roughly 10% spare international oil shipping capacity available to the market. And the amount of spare refining capacity is about 5% higher now than it was in 2007. There's therefore more flexibility in the global oil system now than a few years ago. Second, EIA has looked at a concern more directly related to Egypt involving the possibility of disruption of the Suez Canal or Suez pipeline, which together carry about 3 million barrels a day of oil. The canal and pipeline continue to operate normally, and for reasons outlined in my written testimony, we would expect the direct effects of any closures to be manageable, although there would be undoubtedly an adjustment period. Focusing next on the short-term outlook for oil, EIA expects a continued tightening of world oil markets over the next 2 years. World oil consumption grows by an annual average of 1.5 million barrels per day in 2011 and again in 2012 in our outlook, while supply growth from non-OPEC countries averages about 0.3 million barrels per day this year and remains flat in 2012. Consequently, we expect the market to rely on increased OPEC members' production of crude oil and other liquids and some drawdown in inventories to meet world oil demand growth. With tighter world oil market, EIA expects the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil, the key U.S. pricing benchmark, to average about $93 per barrel in 2011 and $98 per barrel in 2012. EIA expects the retail price of regular gasoline will average $3.15 per gallon this year and $3.30 per gallon in 2012. However, oil and in turn gasoline price forecasts are subject to a great deal of uncertainty. For example, the market value of futures and options contracts is telling us that there is close to a 1 in 3 chance that the price of oil could be above $110 per barrel at the end of the year. I will now turn to the longer-term projections for oil and other liquids from EIA's annual energy outlook. The reference case, which we released in December, represents an energy future through 2035 that assumes continuance of current market and technology trends, consumer behavior, and current laws and regulations. It does not include the effects of potential future policies that have not yet become law, but the reference case represents a baseline that is a useful jumping-off point for assessing alternatives. Reference case crude oil prices continue to rise in our long-term outlook, as a growing global economy underpins oil demand growth that is more rapid than supply growth from non-OPEC producers. By 2035, the average real price of crude oil in the reference case is $125 per barrel in 2009 dollars, although we examine a wide range of oil price scenarios. Total U.S. consumption of oil and other liquid fuels grows from about 19 million barrels per day in 2009 to 22 million barrels per day by 2035. This modest growth in the reference case reflects increasing fuel prices and implementation of finalized standards and statutory mandates that drive the fuel economy of light-duty vehicles up to 35 miles per gallon by 2020. Virtually all of the increase in U.S. liquids consumption is met by biofuels use, driven by the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, along with increases in natural gas liquids. We expect domestic oil production increases to come from onshore enhanced oil recovery projects, and shale oil plays. As a result of this increased domestic production and modest consumption growth, we expect U.S. dependence on imported liquid fuels to continue to decline. After reaching a high of 60% in 2005, the imported petroleum share of total liquid fuel use fell to 52% in 2009 and continues to decline in our projections to 42% by 2035. In addition to preparing the baseline projections I've reviewed this morning, our full annual energy outlook to be released this spring will include a large number of sensitivity cases that examine the impact of different market, technology, and policy assumptions. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this concludes my testimony, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Newell. At this time, I'll call on Mr. Marr for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Mr. Chairman, my name is Gary Marr, Minister Counselor here in Washington, D.C., and I represent the government of Alberta, a province of Canada. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. As a former elected official in the province of Alberta, I've had ministerial responsibilities in areas including health and environment. And I, like you, have had the privilege of debating difficult issues and making tough decisions on behalf of the people who elected me over a period of 14 years. The issue before you here today is that of energy and where and how you will attain that energy, particularly oil. And I believe that my home province, Alberta, has and will continue to have a very important role in providing the United States with an alternative to foreign oil supplies. And I hope that nobody here takes offense with Alberta not really considering itself to be a foreign supplier. Now, if I can leave you with 3 things to take away from my presentation on Alberta oil, they are, number 1, security of supply, number 2, economic benefits, and number 3, responsible development. This is a combination of attributes that is not readily associated with many of the other countries in the world that the United States gets its oil from. For the past 5 years, Canada has and continues to be the largest supplier of imported oil to the United States. In 2009, Canada supplied 23% of America's oil imports, more than double the imports that come from Saudi Arabia, and more than 4 times the imported oil that comes from Iraq. The lion's share of Canada's exports comes from Alberta's oil sands. If you look at Alberta in isolation, we provide 17% of your total crude oil imports, and that is in volume 1.5 million barrels of oil per day that comes to you from Alberta in a transportation system that doesn't move called a pipeline. This number will grow, and the question perhaps for you is, how much will it grow by? The province of Alberta has the distinction of being the largest OECD jurisdiction capable of substantially increasing oil production to meet future demand. In fact, it is forecast that by the year 2019, Alberta will be producing 3.3 million barrels of oil per day compared to current production of 2 million barrels. That represents security of supply. Moreover, our oil comes from a politically stable and democratic neighbor and is sent to the U.S. via pipeline, so it is not affected by political unrest or other disruptions, a point that was supported very recently by a released report of the United States Department of Energy. Alberta oil also far exceeds any other foreign source of oil in economic return that it brings to the United States, and Honorable Shimkus's example of Caterpillar is but one example. I was at Caterpillar's offices in East Peoria yesterday. The largest collection and concentration of Caterpillar trucks in the world is around the area of Fort McMurray, is what I was advised by the people from Caterpillar. For every dollar that the U.S. spends on Canadian products, you get 91 cents in return from the products that we turn around and buy from you. The United States is our largest trading partner by far. There are currently estimated, and this is a very conservative estimate, at the very least more than 900 U.S.-based businesses that are suppliers for Canadian oil sands and related pipeline projects. Mr. Chairman, your state is home to 3 of those companies. The Vice Chairman's home state is home to 36 of them. In addition, over the next 4 years, America will gain 343,000 new jobs as a result of oil sands development. Major U.S. companies like ConocoPhillips, Exxon, Devon, and Marathon have oil sands operations in the province of Alberta. These companies all have first-hand understanding of the stringent rules in place to ensure that energy is developed responsibly in our province and with the highest degree of care and concern for the environment. In 2007, the province of Alberta was the first jurisdiction in North America to regulate large industrial greenhouse gas emitters. Alberta has a price on carbon. To date, we have collected $187 million as a result of this carbon tax. This money is set apart from our general operating fund as a government. It is wholly dedicated to developing clean energy projects, and thus far, $71 million has been invested into 16 different clean energy projects. In addition to this, the government of Alberta has also committed $2 billion to commercial-scale carbon capture and storage projects to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is $2 billion from a province whose population is only 3.5 million people. It is a significant contribution on a per capita basis. At the start of my remarks, I talked about being a former elected official in Alberta, and now I have the pleasure of working here in Washington, and I spend much of my time talking to our American friends about how Alberta can help meet your energy demands. I want you to feel confident that when the people who elect you go to a gas station to fill up on their way to soccer practice or a baseball game, that they're using a product that came from a friend with similar goals and similar values. As the President said last week, our countries are woven together perhaps like no other two countries in the world. We match up more than probably any country on earth. And I agree with that statement emphatically. So, Mr. Chairman, Alberta oil can provide America with security of supply. It does help create jobs and grows our economies. And most importantly, it does both of these responsibly, ensuring that the environment is a top priority. And I look forward to working with the United States to develop sustainable solutions as we continue to advance our clean energy technologies. I thank you for the invitation to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Sminsky, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and other members of the committee. I thought that what I might do to most valuably use your time today is to just try to give you an overview of what's going on in the global oil markets and how I see things developing over the next few years. Let me just go through a few major points here. Oil prices started rising in early 2009. It's raised a lot of concerns, and we've moved from $40 to nearly $100 a barrel. You just heard Dr. Newell talk about gasoline prices up 15% this year. We might hit $3.30 a gallon next year. That certainly has issues for consumers. The OPEC Secretariat, interestingly, makes an awful lot of statements about fundamentals not being responsible for the increase in oil prices, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. In my view, oil demand is driven mainly by economic activity. And last year, most of the economic forecasters are saying the global economy grew by 5%, probably up another 4% again this year. Those are pretty big numbers. The average over the last 30 years for global GDP growth is about 3.3%. So 5% and 4% GDP growth is pretty stunning. Speaking of stunning, the International Energy Agency just this morning said that oil demand grew 2.8 million barrels a day last year. That's a fundamental. That 2.8 million barrels a day far exceeds the 1.5 million barrels a day that the EIA is forecasting for this year, and it's a huge factor, I think, in the marketplace. A lot of this growth is coming in the emerging market countries. It's not the U.S. and Europe and Japan as it was traditionally. That's an important issue. Now, the good news for consumers around the world is that non-OPEC supplies are growing pretty strongly. It's 600,000 barrels a day of growth this year. Last year, the number was probably close to 1 million barrels a day. It's not just places like Canada that you just heard about, China, Brazil, former Soviet Union, and Colombia. Interestingly, the state of North Dakota is seeing a huge increase in oil production coming from the Bakken Formation. And you know, if we could do more of that, you know, more of the Gulf of Mexico that you've talked about, and so on, I think that would really help. The demand is growing faster than non-OPEC supplies. So what that means is OPEC's market share is rising, and without further investments in capacity in OPEC countries, OPEC's spare capacity is going to decline. Now, we also know that inventories have been coming down on a global basis. We can measure them best in the OECD countries. They were as high as 63 days of forward demand cover. We're now down to about 59 days. My forecasts say that by the end of next year, we'll probably be down to 54 days, which is still in the middle of the normal range, not low, but the trend is down. Now, this is really important. Most of the oil forecasting, price forecasting models use OPEC spare capacity and inventories as the main drivers. So now what I've just said is that OPEC spare capacity is likely to shrink and inventories are also coming down. That implies strength in global oil prices, and it's something that I think we need to be cognizant of. Over the last 4 years, financial factors have been very important in driving oil prices. First, it was the dollar exchange rate against the euro and other currencies that seemed to be important. Since March of 2009, when oil prices have gone up, there's been almost a lockstep move with the S&P 500 equity index. Right? So what's going on is that everybody's so happy we're not having a depression that stock markets are going up and lifting commodities in general, including crude oil. I think we're now moving into the area of it's going to be fundamentals more than financial factors. Just like to add that by my calculations, oil prices aren't too far in the United States from what equilibrium levels would be if you looked at it against things like incomes and share of income. Okay. Now, problems in the oil markets, low elasticity of supply and demand. It's an economic phrase. Let me translate that. It takes a long time to plan supply projects and efficiency projects. Mr. Waxman's comments about auto fuel efficiency takes a long time to turn the fleet over. Takes a long time to do a development project in the Gulf of Mexico or in the oil sands in Canada. That means that the chances are good that you're going to have sharp movements in oil prices if something else happens in the markets. Let me just sum up this by saying that as you introduced the hearing today, you said that what we were really trying to get at was events in the Middle East and North Africa and what it meant for the oil markets. The EIA has really good numbers on that, and Dr. Newell talked about them. Clearly, the Middle East falls into this geopolitical category. One of the things that I think that you have to be very, very aware of, that it's not just things that are happening today that matter in setting oil prices and influencing the oil markets. It's expectations about the future. And if we expect that demand is going to continue to grow strongly, if we expect that supply might be constrained, if we expect that there are going to be tensions in the Middle East, that's going to tend to push prices up. That's a fundamental. It's not a speculative kind of activity. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sminsky. Mr. Hofmeister, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush. I'm John Hofmeister, the founder and CEO of Citizens for Affordable Energy. When I retired as the president of Shell Oil Company in 2008, I started a foundation to focus on grassroots energy education. In addition, I'm privileged to serve as the chairman of the National Urban League, where we have 104 affiliates across U.S. cities, where the affordability of energy is a major issue to the people who live in vulnerable circumstances where unemployment in major urban areas exceeds national averages. So I speak with a view that affordability of energy is a critical issue for the United States of America. Affordability goes directly to the price of crude oil. No question about it. Every consumer in this country uses crude oil in one way or another. And we do face the political uncertainties as evidenced most recently by Egypt and the threat to the Suez Canal and the Saddam pipeline. I'm reminded that while this administration has strangled oil production in the Gulf of Mexico for an unpredictable period, China, according to Professor Wenren Zhang at the University of Alberta, is going in exactly the opposite direction. China is planning to build 1.5 million kilometers of highways over the coming decade, and in order to assure a steady crude oil supply to China, has loaned the following countries the following amounts of money. Brazil, $10 billion. Kazakhstan, $10 billion. Venezuela, $20 billion. Ghana, $16 billion. The Democratic Republic of Congo, $7 billion. Nigeria, $23 billion. And Russia, $25 billion. China expects crude oil demand of 18 million barrels a day. By the end of the decade, they're currently at about 9. Meanwhile, in the United States, today, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, we will consume about 20 million barrels a day, producing only 7 domestically. As long as the U.S. produces so limited amount of its own supply, we are vulnerable to whatever happens anywhere in the world. The U.S. forfeited its energy security over a sustained period of decades by prohibiting drilling on 85% of the outer continental shelf, by prohibiting drilling on 97% of federal land, by standing in the way of many infrastructure developments that would otherwise enable enhanced oil production in many parts of old oil fields. It's my view that while people focus on transportation and the use of oil, we should not forget that within that 20 million barrel per day demand, there is an entire petrochemical industry that needs crude oil as feedstock. That petrochemical industry produces the fiber which we use for clothing and other industrial purposes. It produces the pharmaceuticals, the lubricants, the food that we use to eat in this country. We have many more needs for oil than simply transportation purposes. While it's great to have 1 million new vehicles, hybrids and battery cars on the roads by 2015, the 250 million automobiles and tens of millions of trucks, tractors, planes, boats, buses, and other transportation vehicles depend upon a daily supply of crude oil. I'd like to use my remaining time to speak about what I think are the concrete actions that could be taken with a plan from this Congress or the administration, or preferably both, which would take this country forward to create jobs in an unprecedented number. Example, we know we have the natural resources in the ground to produce far more oil than we do today. I'm suggesting that with the billions and billions of barrels, that is enough to sustain an increase in domestic production for all of the generations currently alive in this country. We could move daily production from 7 million barrels a day to 10 million barrels a day using not a dime of public money, using private investment. The 10 million barrel per day production would create 3 million new jobs. 3 million new jobs over the course of the next decade, which would be a tide to raise all ships. Because it's not just the drilling workers that would be benefiting from this, but it would be the steel makers, the automakers, the valve makers, the pipe makers, the people who build the homes, the people who set up the retail networks in order to supply these 3 million people with good-paying jobs with good benefits. We currently employ 9.2 million people in America in the gas and oil business to produce 7 million barrels a day. 3 more million barrels a day and 3 million more jobs is an unprecedented number that no one has talked about since the beginning of the recession in this country. And if we're looking for ideas to improve the economy, I can't think of a better one that is right here at home, jobs which will not be exported. In addition, we have failed to deal with the need for electricity going forward in material ways. And it's my belief that we could build new power plants, coal as well as nuclear, clean coal, which will in fact create additional jobs on top of that. Mr. Chairman, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Busch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Rush. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. My name is Chris Busch, and I am the Policy and Program Director for the Apollo Alliance. We are a national alliance of labor, business, environmental, and community groups working towards clean energy solutions that also grow the economy and improve American competitiveness. Every president since Nixon has sought to lessen our dependency on imported oil. Though we have started to turn the corner thanks to policies like the 2010 Clean Car Standards, America still faces this challenge. Nearly 60% of U.S. demand is now met by imported oil. The U.S. accounts for 22% of the world's oil consumption, but we only possess 1.4% of the world's proven reserves. Those numbers are slightly different than Mr. Waxman's, but those are according to the EIA's 2009 data. These numbers tell a simple truth. No matter how deep we drill, domestic oil supplies cannot solve this problem. We must put in place policies to address the demand side of the problem. And fortunately for America, there are promising transportation policy options that work hand in glove with market incentives to encourage energy savings and innovation. These policies can help consumers save money. They also position American industry to succeed in a fast-growing global market for clean technologies. Consider the example of the new federal car and light truck fuel economy standards finalized last year. The EPA estimates that the standards will reduce oil demand by 1.8 billion barrels for vehicles sold through 2016. And as Mr. Waxman mentioned, when the standard is fully phased in, the average consumer will save about $3,000 over the life of their vehicle. That's about $150 per vehicle each year. I'd like to talk about some research I did in California with Jamie Fine of the Environmental Defense Fund and Ramy Garderet of Energy Independence Now. We calculated the benefits of reduced oil dependency due to AB 32, California's capstone clean energy law. AB 32 reduces California's dependency on imported oil through clean car and clean fuel standards and by providing alternatives to driving. We found that in the year 2020, California will avoid demand equal to 75 million barrels of oil, about an 18% decrease due to AB 32 policies. At the 2009 Department of Energy's mid-range price forecast, which was $114.50 per barrel, those were the numbers we were working with when we were doing this research. That reduces California's imported oil bill by about $11 billion. While shaving $11 billion off the state's import bill is a significant avoided cost, we also estimated the benefits following an oil price shock. We have experienced 6 significant price shocks in the past 40 years. We all remember oil nearing $150 per barrel in 2008. Oil price shocks have been a reality of world oil markets, and surging demand from China and other countries suggests they will become more common, not less. Our analysis looked at two oil price shocks that caused the price of gasoline and diesel to jump by roughly $1 or $2 above a starting point of $3.42 per gallon in the case of gasoline. The diesel jump is more like $2.50, and these were linked to the oil shocks we were looking at. The result of these oil shocks is that AB 32 saves consumers an additional $3 to $7 billion, or about $200 to $500 per household when the savings are distributed over the households projected to exist in 2020 in California. One of our objectives was to help policymakers understand what is and what is not included in the economic analyses they receive and depend upon. Though oil price shocks are a reality, economic studies are not capturing these painful economic effects. Typically, energy policy analyses assume smooth prices. National security implications as well as pollution reductions and related public health benefits are also almost never integrated in economic analyses of energy policy. Attacking the demand side of our imported oil dependency is where real progress will be made. The Apollo Alliance has recently advanced a clean transportation manufacturing action plan that I would like to ask be entered in the record. I have it here. The plan calls for increased investment in public transit and railway, as well as stronger Buy America provisions and loan assistance to help grow domestic manufacturing jobs. The plan is projected to create 3.7 million jobs over 6 years. These are new jobs in every region of the country and include more than 600,000 manufacturing jobs. This is part of the Sputnik challenge described by the President. We have the technologies needed to get started, and while the world needs American leadership in advancing the innovation frontier further, the big winner will be the American worker. Thank you for considering my testimony.
Thank you. Mr. John, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, thank you very much for inviting me to come and testify in front of this very distinguished body, a body that I was privileged to serve in for 4 years. Seems like an eternity ago. But it is a very important subject matter. I was asked to specifically talk about world and international events and how it affects what goes on domestically in our oil production all over America. As chairman of Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association, I represent all of the companies that explore, produce, market, transport from the ground to the tank is what I like to say. And the fact of the matter is, when we look at energy policy in this country, it cannot be an either-or. The fact of the matter is, we need all drops and all kinds of energy to satisfy to make America more energy secure. But I think the real factor, the factor that we must keep in focus like a rifle shot as we debate some of these, is the energy reality that we have in this country. I think it's very important not to deviate from, because we can talk about assumptions and we can talk about politics and we can look at it from a geographical standpoint. The fact of the matter is that you must be grounded in our conversations about the energy reality in this country. And that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of my time on. The fact of the matter is that 78%, the energy reality today, not tomorrow, not yesterday, but today, is that 78% of our fuel needs, our energy needs, is going to come from fossil fuels. 78% from fossil fuels. You'll have 12% from nuclear. You'll have 3% from hybrid, 1% from wind, 0.5% from solar, and then it goes down from there. I think that's an important point as we discuss the future of energy policy in this country, because even the DOE says that 60% of our energy needs over the next 25 years are going to come from fossil fuels. There have been experts that obviously have said more higher than that I believe is closer to 80% for the next 50 years, that fossil fuels are going to play a very important part in providing energy security for America. And why should we care what goes on in different parts of the country? Obviously, the incidents in Egypt, whether perceived or reality, has had an impact on the domestic oil production and the price. And getting a little less attention is what's happened off the coast of Oman, where the Somali pirates have commandeered a Greek vessel with almost 2 million barrels of crude that is destined to the Gulf of Mexico for refinery and use in our markets today. So it really is important to understand the energy reality and where it comes from. And that's my next point. I want to talk about, Mr. Hofmeister talked about the 20 million barrels. I've used this several times, Mr. Hofmeister, where I said, we used 20 million yesterday, we're using it today, we need it tomorrow. And that's just a fact. That's another energy reality check fact that needs to be looked at. But when you break down the 20 million barrels that we need, 7 million are produced right here domestically, and we import 13 million. Let me peel back the banana just a little bit more. Where does that 7 million come from? Well, the 7 million comes from basically 53% of our oil that we use domestically, or that is produced domestically in the United States. 30% comes from the Gulf of Mexico, 20% comes from Texas, and 4% comes from Louisiana onshore. So you're looking at 54% of our domestic production coming from the Gulf region, the Gulf of Mexico and the region. But I think more important is to look at where we get the 13% of the 13 million barrels that we use every day. It comes from countries that obviously do not share a lot of our values. We spend billions of dollars in buying crude oil that could be used right here in America to create jobs. When you look at it, 23%, thank you very much, comes from Canada, our neighbor to the north. 12% from Mexico, which is our two largest importers. But then you have 26% from OPEC countries, 15% from the Persian Gulf area, of which 10% comes from Saudi Arabia. So I think that it's very important to not only understand how much we use domestically, but where it comes from domestically, and also how much we use and how much we have to import and where that comes from. That in itself provides the answer to the question that this committee is somewhat looking for. Why should we care about international events? When we are vulnerable to 13 million barrels a day coming from regions all over the world, then you're going to be very vulnerable to price fluctuations like we have seen here of late. And obviously, the future of the Gulf of Mexico was very bright. I could spend another 5 or 50 minutes talking about the Gulf of Mexico and the moratorium and the pursuing permatorium that we are dealing with today. But the jobs that are created in this industry, I think Mr. Hofmeister is absolutely correct. Only in Louisiana, I can speak parochial a second here because I love Louisiana and I certainly live and work there today. 320,000 jobs in Louisiana alone are created by oil and gas. 9.2 million in America. $70 billion, an economic driver in the state of Louisiana. This moratorium obviously has been an issue that we've worked on, and we're going to continue to work through that. I've got a written statement that I submitted that goes on to talk a little bit more about different things. But, I believe that there's more to a barrel of oil than the BTUs, and you've got to look at the economic impact that the oil and gas industry has both on jobs in America and providing our energy security that we must have. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. John, and thank all of you for your testimony. Mr. Hofmeister, in your opening statement, you talked about the possibility of increasing demand from 7 to 10 million barrels a day, and I think you indicated without any public funds. Would you elaborate on that a little bit about what regions of the country do you think that's possible to do? Where would that happen? And tell us a little bit about that.
If you break down where the oil sits, and while I agree that the narrow definition of reserves as required by the Securities and Exchange Commission suggests the U.S. has only 2, maybe 3% of proven reserves, there are probable reserves, and there are resources in the ground not counted in that number. So we're looking at more than 1 trillion barrels of oil in the United States available that could be addressed from an exploration and production. But specifically, East Coast offshore, Eastern Gulf of Mexico, Western Gulf of Mexico, especially deep water. Off the West Coast, there are billions of barrels. Off of the Alaska coast, Bristol Bay, Chukchi Sea, Beaufort Sea, the Bakken Formation, enhanced oil recovery from former or existing oil fields, and most importantly, oil shale in the Piceance Basin of Colorado, which includes Wyoming and Utah. The combination of all of those over the period of a decade or more could take us way beyond 10 million barrels. But I realize some people are concerned about the sensitivities. So I've only suggested a target of 10 million at this stage. Right. When we get to 10, we could consider more.
But if the proper government policies were in place, do you think that 10 million could be reached relatively quickly?
If you consider the capital investment plans of not just the major oil companies, but also the major independents and the small oil companies, we're in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year, much of that targeted for outside the United States because that's where they are welcomed.
Right.
That's where they are wanted. That's where they're creating jobs.
Right.
Redirecting those billions to the U.S. because we would in turn welcome them to create American jobs in America would be a reversal of where we've been over a number of decades.
Right. Well, as you well know, this administration has been totally focused on green energy projects, which are fine, and I know billions of dollars or millions of dollars in the stimulus fund went to green energy projects, but I think most of us agree that this is a long-term solution to our problem. And Mr. John, I know that the moratorium was put in place sometime last spring, and then the court ruled it was illegal, and then a new moratorium was put into place, lawsuits were filed, and then Mr. Salazar, I think, removed that moratorium. But in effect, there is a moratorium because no permits have been issued in the Gulf, have they? Or has it?
No, that is correct. There, to my knowledge, as of yesterday, There were no new drilling permits issued
Okay.
in the Gulf of Mexico. The moratorium was set in place May the 27th, and then, of course, there was a subsequent court battle, which obviously threw out the moratorium, and then I think just a week or 2 weeks later, the administration came up with another moratorium.
Right.
And that in itself, I think, Mr. Chairman, is very troubling. I like to believe, and maybe this is a little subjective, that the process at which this came down
Yeah.
has been more harmful than the actual moratorium.
Well, let me ask you, hasn't the federal judge that's holding that case, hasn't he actually held the Obama administration in contempt of court?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I read that in yesterday or a couple of days ago in the paper that the judge is now holding this administration in contempt for violating his orders.
Well, it has certainly been in and out of the courts and decisions, and all of this time we have 30,000 people at the minimum waiting to go back to work in the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, Mr. Hofmeister's suggestion, which I certainly agree with, he said would create about 3 million more jobs, certainly help make us less dependent, create all these jobs, as you said. Now, Dr. Busch, you talked about your Apollo Alliance, and you mentioned in here public transit rail projects. Are you talking about private expenditures there, or are you talking about government expenditures?
Well, government expenditures, but I think, there is a role for private-public partnerships, and sort of loan guarantees can help leverage.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem that we have today about any more government expenditures is just the fact of the financial situation we're in. And the great thing about what Mr. Hofmeister is talking about is that we're talking about private dollars here, and that's, in my view, the way we need to go right now. But my time has expired, so I'll recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
I certainly want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Hofmeister. I agree with you that the level of investment that China is doing overseas, especially in emerging markets, is alarming. The U.S. is not doing well in these markets, and it seems to me that it's almost akin to us killing our mothers and our fathers, and then we complain about being an orphan. And I'm a strong believer that the U.S. should invest in emerging markets and not leave all the strategic resources into our competitors' control. And that leads me to, I looked at the World Transit choke points through which almost half the world oil productions are moving through. I looked at the map where each of these 7 choke points are located, compared it to U.S. imports from major players, especially in the Middle East, and from offshore and West African coasts. That West African coast where China's aggressively investing already, and I realize that none of these imports are going through these choke points. You headed Shell Oil with global operations. Can you tell me which other maritime routes are being used to supply the North American market, and how you would characterize those routes? That's the first question. Second question is in regards to our overseas supply, putting aside our NAFTA partners, Mexico and Canada. How would you characterize the cost efficiencies of those crude imports, taking into account the quality of the crude transportation costs, the current and projected volume, and the security of supply? And my last question, if you answer all these, which of the major overseas exporting countries have favorable and positive policies and attitudes toward the U.S.? And I just want to make sure that I think the chairman in his opening remarks made note of the fact that he thought that there were some of the countries, Angola and Nigeria, I think he mentioned specifically, that have a hostile relationship with the U.S., and I just wanted to correct that. I think they got a very friendly relationship with the U.S. So would you speak to those choke points and those issues?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I think with respect to the choke points, the three most serious are the Suez Canal, the Hormuz Straits, which is separating Iran from Yemen, Oman and Iran, and the Straits of Malacca, which is between Malaysia and Indonesia. These choke points carry enormous amounts of crude oil. In fact, a former colleague, Matt Simmons, who passed away this past summer, used to speak of the Straits of Hormuz as we live one day away from an oil Pearl Harbor. In other words, those Straits of Hormuz transport between 20 and 25% of daily consumption of global oil. And were they to be shut in, the world would be in a panic overnight if it were not possible to pass oil. With respect to your second question, I think the countries such as Venezuela, Nigeria, Angola, in the future Brazil, also Russia, these are countries which are looking at the U.S. markets quite favorably. They want to be a supplier. But there are issues in each of those countries. The socialistic regime in Venezuela makes a very unpredictable supplier, not only to the United States but elsewhere. While Nigeria has an officially favorable outlook on the United States market, as we know, Nigeria is infected by criminal gangs that not only deal with onshore but also now offshore oil. Russia has proven to Europe that it is an unpredictable supplier, and we could find ourselves in the same boat.
I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Chairman of the committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Marr, not long ago, as I recall, Canada was producing about 1 million barrels per day from the tar sands, oil sands. Your testimony talks about getting that production up to maybe as much as from 1 million to 3.3 million barrels by 2019. What type of incentives? I mean, how are you getting from 1 to 3.3? You know, what have been the inducements to get there quickly?
Thank you, sir. First of all, I should talk about the overall size of the resource of the oil that's in place in Alberta in the oil sands. It's roughly 1.7 trillion barrels of oil, of which, with current technology and prices, about 10% of it is accessible, so roughly 170 billion barrels. So there's certainly ample room to move up our production to the 3.3 million barrels a day. It's a very realistic target. In terms of the policies of the province of Alberta, there are policies in place to recognize that the upfront costs of developing oil sands are very, very high. There are no exploratory costs to speak of, really, because we know exactly where it is. But there are enormous costs up front in terms of capital investment that is required by private sector investment to do that. The government policy permits those who will invest to pay their royalties only after payout from their original investment. And so that is really the only incentive that is the strongest incentive that the government puts in place to ensure that there isn't purchases of land leases to develop oil sands.
What is likely to happen if the U.S. doesn't permit the Keystone pipeline to be built?
Well, we will continue to use existing pipelines.
But what will happen to the bulk of that new production?
Well, there has been investment by many companies from around the world. Not just American companies are invested in the oil sands. State-owned enterprises from China have invested themselves in the oil sands. The Statoil Hydro of Norway.
So is China proposing to build a pipeline to the west?
Well, there currently is a pipeline that goes from Alberta to the west coast. Small amounts of that oil on the spot market end up going to China on tankers. But there is a proposal currently by a private sector company, Enbridge Pipelines, to build a project called the Gateway Pipeline to take
And
that oil
just
to tidewater.
quickly, how double, triple the capacity? How much capacity ultimately to the west, particularly if Keystone's not built?
I actually don't know.
If you could get that for the record.
I'm happy to.
Mr. Hofmeister, some very troubling numbers in recent months, really. As we look at our domestic production from the Gulf, which is basically about a third of our domestic production comes from the Gulf, we've gone from, in 09, 1.56 million barrels per day, to in 10, 1.64, so a little bit of an increase. 11 this year, we're expecting that to decline to about 1.39, and in 12, further decline to 1.14 million barrels per day. In essence, 420,000 barrels fewer than we got over a 2-year span. And as I understand it from some discussions in the recent weeks, we're actually, this year, they're predicting that the 1.39 is about 250,000 barrels less than they projected even a year ago. Alaska's the same. We've seen these numbers tail off as well. In essence, going from 0.65 million barrels in 09 to what will be 0.52 in 12. Very troubling is this Wall Street Journal piece from last Friday. Shell postpones plan for offshore Alaska drilling. In essence, I want to say, I think it was they had received 34 permits, and the last one, the Environmental Appeals Board pulled the air quality permit from your days at Shell before. Shell, I think, had spent about $3.5 billion on this particular site, where they think there's as much as 25 billion barrels down below. Tell us a little bit about what would happen if we follow through on what the President indicated in the State of the Union address, that we're going to take away some of the incentives from domestic drilling, particularly as you try to get from 7 to 10 million barrels a day?
Chairman Upton, I've been on the record in many public forums suggesting that by the end of 2012, this country will face $5 gasoline, precisely because of the path that we are on, which you describe, and I believe your numbers cited are optimistic. I believe that the decline in
I'm a Cubs fan. That's probably why.
The decline in the Gulf of Mexico, I believe, will be sharper and deeper than what anyone is currently projecting, because the decline rate from existing wells, particularly deep water, fall off naturally very quickly. And the reason we had 34 rigs drilling in the Gulf of Mexico was not so much to increase the rate of production, but to sustain the rate of production in the Gulf of Mexico. While there may have been some increase, absent drilling, I mean, we have made a horrible error as a country. The rest of the world did not discontinue offshore drilling. With respect to the Alaska project you mentioned, I no longer speak officially for my former company, but beginning in 2005, that company began the process of obtaining the permits through 2006, 2007, 8, 9. I retired in 2008. The company continues, and it's now moved, according to the newspaper report, potentially 2012. 7 years to simply drill 2 exploratory wells just to see what's there. That's the degree of frustration that American companies experience. And if you notice, no other companies are mentioned in the Alaska. While they have leases, they're not going to spend money when the regulatory regime is so difficult to achieve a single permit, which was granted at one time and then rescinded on appeal, so in terms of losing that particular air quality permit. So we have a real strangulation by regulation taking place for domestic production at the current time in this country.
Thank you.
Mr. Inslee, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you. I wanted to explore with Dr. Newell whether or not substantially increased opening of federal lands would have an impact on the price of fuel at the pump. And I want to read your agency's evaluation of this issue. It's a study quoted impact of limitations on access to oil and natural gas resources in the federal outer continental shelf. This is a study in 2009. Now, a lot of folks would think if we just open up the spigot off the outer continental shelf and other places, problem solved on prices. I want to read what your agency concluded after looking at it. You concluded, quote, the average price of imported low sulfur crude oil in 2030 in $2007 is $1.34 per barrel higher, and the average U.S. price of motor gasoline price is 3 cents per gallon higher than in the reference case. Now, close quote, as I understand what you're saying is, when you looked at this issue and really looked at the economics of this issue, your agency concluded that if we essentially removed all federal restrictions on outer continental shelf drilling, in 2030, after everything had been exploited to the extent the human mind can consider, the price would be 3 cents different in 2030. Now, that's pretty stunning because a lot of people, particularly on the other side of the aisle, figure we'll just solve this cost problem by just opening up the spigot everywhere in the United States, including Yellowstone National Park and the mall off the Capitol Mall. But your conclusion seems to suggest that there's a negligible, almost infinitesimal difference if we do that in price. Now, my understanding would be the reason for your conclusion is essentially it's a world market for oil. And since we have such a small amount of the world market, at 3% tops of the world market, we're not going to affect the cost very much, no matter where we drill in the United States, continental outer shelf, Arctic, you name it. Secondly, there's a phenomenon that every time we increase our drilling, OPEC can decrease theirs to maintain the price that they desire, because that's where the oil is in the world. Now, are those the two primary reasons that you concluded there'd be a negligible, if almost infinitesimal difference of price, or are there others that I have not alluded to?
I think you've captured some of the main factors that would come into play in analyzing that kind of question. In terms of the effect of increased access and production of domestic oil on global oil prices, in addition to the access issue, there's a question about whether or not those fields would be produced, which would depend on the cost of producing them. It would depend upon the price of oil that one could get in the marketplace. And so access is one piece of it. It would depend on the magnitude of areas that are open to access and the amount of production that would come from that. And then you would have to take that amount of production in the global context in terms of the overall oil supply and demand. In the previous analyses that EIA has done, the magnitude of increased production that tends to be associated with some of these actions is measured in the hundreds of thousands of barrels per day, which is a significant magnitude, but in the global scheme of things, it tends to be significantly less than 1% of global oil supply, and so therefore, in terms of global impacts on price, it tends to be small.
Quite negligible. Second question, we look for bipartisanship. We haven't been able to find it on climate change. My Republican colleagues still insist on ignoring the clear scientific consensus about this. But there is a bipartisan consensus about concern for oil supplies, price that our people pay at the pump, and national security issues. And I think there's room for bipartisanship by adopting a scenario where we try to maintain a climate that doesn't increase more than 2 degrees. And your colleagues at the International Energy Agency have concluded that if we embrace an effort to limit the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that would result in a 2-degree increase in world temperature. So if we try to limit it to that increase, we would have a significant reduction in decreasing the cost of oil. They have concluded that if we took action to limit it to 2 degrees, we would essentially drop U.S. imports by 45% from 10.4 million barrels in 2009 to 5.7 million barrels to 2035, a last seen in 1980s. They found under the 2-degree scenario, we'd have a significantly weaker demand with that demand falling briskly thereafter. Oil prices were much lower as a result. If we really do something about climate change by reducing CO2 emissions and reduce demand for oil, can that help us restrain the price increases of oil?
We have not specifically evaluated a global scenario like the International Agency has. I mean, we have on different occasions evaluated, U.S. energy and climate policies. If there was a significant reduction in global oil demand as a result of some set of policies that would tend to bring price down, other things equal, in the world oil price, there might be a difference, though, between the world oil price and the retail price paid that one would need to take into account, though.
Just for the record, just wanted to correct something.
We let you almost go over. One comment I would just make, we've been advocating additional exploration. Certainly one part of that figure is the price, but just as important is having the supply to meet the demands of our economy. I recognize the gentleman from Texas for Mr. Barton, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would be happy to yield to my friend from Washington for that last question if it's a short one, and if the answer could be relatively short. I don't want to cut him off in mid-sentence.
Mr. Barton, I appreciate your continuing courtesy. I just want to point out the study that I referred to suggested that the world oil price would be $90 per barrel in 2035 if we adopted measures to restrain demand consistent with reducing climate change to limit it to 2 degrees. And thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Barton.
Thank you. Of course, I think everyone knows that Mr. Inslee and I don't share the exact same view on climate change, but we do share that we need to discuss views in this committee. That's what it's all about. Mr. Newell, I know the Energy Information Administration is more of a data collection and reporting agency within the Department of Energy. Do you, in your position, have any authority to speak on behalf of the Obama administration or Secretary Chu on policy issues?
No.
So you're more of a reporting and data collection, and that's fine. I'm not trying to. That's not pejorative. I mean, I was going to ask some policy questions of you, but if you're not authorized to answer, I won't do that. I will ask you this, though. Do you have any projections within your agency that show a significant reduction in oil demand worldwide?
The scenario that I discussed earlier, our reference case scenario for domestic liquids consumption, we expect an modest increase in domestic liquids production. Petroleum consumption in the United States, we expect to be...
No, I'm talking about worldwide, not just the United States.
Worldwide, we're projecting, under current laws and policies internationally, a significant increase in global liquids consumption.
Significant increase.
Yes.
Is there anybody on the panel that has an alternative view that we can somehow bend the demand curve and send it significantly lower? Yes, sir.
Let me just jump in there. In my forecast, about the year 2020, overall global demand begins to level off. So and I think that that's mainly going to be a function of a better consumption per unit of economic output numbers in the emerging market countries. So we're already seeing the OECD countries' overall demand numbers flattening, probably coming down. And in another 10 years, we should begin to see that happening in the emerging market countries.
Yeah. Well, I would postulate that based on the economy worldwide, if we are able to restart the U.S. economy and the European and the Asian economies and the Chinese economies grow, that there is going to be a substantial increase in demand for oil, even with the best efforts on energy conservation and things like that. So that would tell me that for U.S. energy security, we should try to increase U.S. energy production of all sorts, natural gas, oil, clean coal, wind, solar. We should support research into clean coal, CO2 sequestration if we can see a light at the end of the tunnel on the technology. But we definitely need to try to, in my opinion, increase our domestic energy resources. Mr. John, do you have any information if we could really restart exploration in the Gulf, what kind of an increase we could get in production from that, say, in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, in my statement that I submitted, it talks about kind of the production curve of what is in the Gulf and what can be produced in the Gulf, and it shows really a somewhat of a decline. However, it is important to understand that you just don't turn the switch on and off. In a deep water project where you have $1 billion piece of equipment in a floating ship, a floating drill ship, from start to finish, by the time you actually lease the property till you explore, then produce, pipeline, and it gets into the market, is somewhere in the 2 to 5 year range, just depending on a lot of elements. In fact, the Deepwater Macondo well the lease sale of that piece of property was in 2008. So that was a 2-year span, and they weren't in production. So the lag time is what's very critical, because there's going to be a bubble anytime you take 30% of our domestic production offline, and it has been offline since the 27th of May. There's a bubble. It won't happen tomorrow or the next day, but it is coming, and it is going to have some sort of impact, a negative impact on the supply.
Yeah, my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Mr. Green was next, but I see he's not here. Mr. Markey, you recognize 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman very much. Yesterday, this subcommittee held a hearing on Republican legislation that will bar EPA from doing anything further to reduce oil use from cars, trucks, planes, boats, or any other source. The legislation might even nullify the progress that has already been made at the EPA in reducing demand for oil from cars and trucks and through the development of homegrown renewable fuels. The Republican bill could result in an increase in our oil dependence of more than 5 million barrels a day by the year 2030, more than we currently import from OPEC. We have heard disturbing rumors that this legislation could be marked up or even added to the continuing resolution on the House floor next week. But today, here we are, holding a hearing on the effect of Middle East unrest on the oil market, as though the Republican legislation that will dramatically increase our dependence on Middle Eastern oil didn't even exist. It reminds me a lot of when Monsignor O'Malley used to go up into the pulpit on Sunday and lecture to the congregation that on Wednesday in the church hall, Father Guiney will lecture on the evils of gambling. On Thursday night in the church hall, bingo. Well, yesterday we're lectured on the evils of the EPA. Today, bingo. Egypt, bingo. Iraq, Iran, Tunisia, bingo, 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 bingo. So let me ask each of you. Let's go down the list, and I'd like a yes, a no, on whether or not you feel it's important for us to stop $162 billion a year going to OPEC, going to Middle Eastern countries that are paid for by American consumers at $90 a barrel, so that we're not subsidizing religious fanaticism in Saudi Arabia. We're not subsidizing rockets being constructed in Iran that are then used by Hezbollah and Hamas against Israel and against our countries. So let me just ask each of you if you believe, number one, that reducing our dependence upon imported oil from the Middle East is important. Dr. Newell, yes or no?
That would tend to involve a policy position which I'm not in a
Okay, Mr. Marr, is that important?
Sir, as a representative of another government, I'm not.
Okay, Mr. Szymanski, is that important? We're talking about Egypt here. It's a hearing on Egypt and its impact on oil prices. And we're talking about the Middle East here, not Canada. We're not talking about Norway.
How about that? Is that be okay?
Mr. Szymanski.
Mr. Markey, I'm going to try to answer your question, actually, but I can't do it in one word. I'll try to be brief.
No, thank you. Mr. Hofmeister, yes and no. Is it important for us to reduce our oil dependence on the Middle East? Yes, Mr. Hofmeister.
Mr. Markey, my answer to that would be no, then, if I can only say
It's
one
not
word.
important. Okay, thank you. Mr. Hofmeister.
Absolutely critical to reduce dependence on the Middle East.
Thank you. Dr. Busch.
Yes.
Yes.
I think it's important to increase our domestic production, and if that means reduced from the Middle East, in my
But
yes.
should our goal be to reduce
Yes.
dependence upon Middle Eastern oil? Okay, thank you. Now, so given that, should we be unilaterally disarming ourselves of any of the weapons that we have in our arsenal to reduce demand for Middle Eastern oil? Mr. John.
Mr. Markey, you are still on the top of your game, but
And under the 5-minute rule.
yes. So four corners doesn't work here. Then no, it's obviously you bring a very good point. The point is that America and the world consumption of oil is going to increase.
Okay. Bottom line, can I say this? I'm going to run out of time. Bottom line here is we can't afford to not improve the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive. That is our number one weapon against the Middle East. That's when we're teaching them a lesson. That's President Kennedy telling Khrushchev, we're putting a man on the moon in 10 years and bringing him back. You're not controlling outer space. We're using our technology to dominate you. Okay? That's our message to the Middle East. They have 70% of the oil reserves in the world, the Middle East. We cannot beat them at that game with only 3% of the oil reserves. It is irresponsible to talk about basically tying the hands of the EPA to improve our ability to make ourselves efficient, to back out this oil from the Middle East. And next week's vote, if we have it, will be a historical one.
Mr. Sullivan, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having me follow Mr. Markey. It's not something I enjoy very much, and he is very good, by the way, at what he does. I just want to touch on this again for a little bit. According to the National Petroleum Council, technically recoverable resources in the North America currently restricted by law or regulation amount to over 40 billion barrels of oil. 40 billion barrels of oil. The answer to our energy security question is staring us right in the face, but the simple fact is that the Obama administration is hostile to developing oil and gas, and they have taken a decisive regulatory position against increased domestic oil production. And let's just take a look at this again. On December 1st, 2010, the Obama administration announced a new offshore drilling ban that will keep the eastern Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic and Pacific coasts off limits to new offshore exploration until 2017, and the administration just announced that new drilling permits in the Gulf may not happen until June 2011. These actions send terrible signals to the world oil markets, and it makes our nation more vulnerable to oil price swings due to the rising demand and political upheaval. And I guess my question would be to Congressman John and Mr. Hofmeister. And Congressman John, you referenced that 38,000 jobs are at risk because of the moratorium or permatorium in the deep water Gulf. Though that doesn't mean every job has been lost. Companies are doing what they can to keep workers on the payroll while drilling projects remain in a standstill. And that means companies in many cases are spending millions of dollars a day to keep mass layoffs from occurring. And I have a company in my district that's in the Gulf right now, and I met with them not long ago, and they're sitting idle, paying like $1 million a day to service companies and the rig operators. And they asked me, when am I going to get a permit? They said that, believe it or not, that the regulators and the bureaucrats don't even return their phone calls. Are you hearing that? And how much longer do you think these companies can last without opening for new drilling? And do you have any indication? Do you have any indication how much money has been lost by exploration companies since the initial drilling moratorium? And if you could help me, what should I say to these companies? When will they get their permit?
Well, Congressman Sullivan, that's a question that I get every day because I live amongst the people that actually and make a living day to day. And it's not just in a pipe company or a wireline company. It is the caterer in the poor boy shop, and the caterers and the ice companies and the hardware stores. So I get that answer every day. The math is very easy to do. There were 33 drill ships. There's 240 people per drill ship that work, a full-time equivalent. If you multiply that out, that's about 38,000 people whose job is at risk today. Now, let's back that back. 6 drilling ships are gone. And those drill ships, as I mentioned earlier, are a $1 billion piece of equipment. You don't just move them one day in an area of the world and move them back 6 months later. They're gone for 3 years to 5 years because that's the contractual obligations that they are insisting on having. Those drill ships are $400,000 a day rate. That's how much they were getting. Some of the companies now have negotiated a day rate below 100. How long can they stay? I mean, I think we're getting towards the end of that. I think that you see that we've got 27 drill ships that are idled right now, kind of waiting to see. But at some point in time, 2 of which have already are in the middle of negotiation, that are going to leave. And when they leave, it's 5 years. And it's about 2,000 jobs per drill ship when you multiply the factor of 4.1 to each job, E&P job that's created.
Mr. Hofmeister?
I would suggest that the effects of the shutdown in the Gulf of Mexico will be felt for the next 3 to 5 years from where we are today, even if we started permits in the next 6 months. One of the, if you followed the fourth quarter reports of most of the major oil companies from Chevron and others, they are reporting hundreds of millions of dollars of expenses in maintaining capability for the Gulf of Mexico, for which there is no return. So these are absolute out-of-pocket costs. How long they can continue is unknown. Fortunately, most of the companies have alternative projects where they can reassign people, avoiding layoffs. But the overall reduction in domestic production in the U.S. will be felt for years into the future.
Thank you. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think all our panel talks about our susceptibility to any little minor thing that happens because of our dependence on oil. And coming from Texas, I can see it. In fact, all the testimony we have, whether it be from our former colleague or John Hofmeister or any others on the panel, that we are, based on susceptible to it simply because we import so much. And when we have the what's happened in the Gulf of Mexico for now almost the last 10 months, that there's very few permits. We fought over shallow water permits as compared to deep water permits, and it's really frustrating. And we've actually taken with some of our companies actually saying, okay, when did you apply for it? We will try and work it through. And we're hitting the same stone wall that most folks are having. Maybe our Energy Subcommittee or maybe the Oversight Committee should invite someone from the Department of Interior. We have some jurisdiction over that, and I know we did last year, and we might do that again. The frustrating thing is, again, I have a district in Texas. I have 5 refineries, and we need the crude oil. If we don't get it from the Gulf, and all the fracking we can do, we get very little oil from the fracking, although there's some great things going on in South Texas and the Ford Shale, but still not enough. So that's why the Canadian pipeline is important, because we need that crude oil. I would rather have it from domestic sources, but the next place is Canada, because we know Venezuela and Mexico's production is decreasing. We can buy everything from Mexico if we want, but obviously President Chavez is not our best friend. So that's the issue that I'm concerned about, and particularly to my constituents in East Harris County and North Harris County. Mr. Hofmeister, I guess I have to say we've known each other for a long time, obviously, as CEO of Shell, and one of those refineries is a Shell facility. We also have a chemical plant. But your testimony, you said we live in a both-and world and not an either-or. You know, I've supported alternative research for everything on alternatives, but it still won't get us where we need to get. We still need oil to fuel our economy. My questions are really for the Administrator Newell, and that I think is the concern I have. How can we know the production from 10 to 11? We saw an increase in production actually from 09 projected, But now we're seeing a decrease in production, particularly because of what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. How would our annual energy outlook differ if the offshore moratorium had not been put in place and if we were not now facing endless permitting delays? Have you been able to quantify that at the EIA?
We have not specifically looked at the what if the moratorium had never happened. There have been implications of that in our short-term and long-term outlook, though. We're forecasting that for this year, 2011, about 250,000 barrels per day lower production offshore, and another decline of similar magnitude in 2012, which is in part due to the moratorium, in part due to natural decline at existing fields. So there is an impact there. It's very difficult to isolate one particular factor, but that would be a significant piece of that.
Well, it's interesting because some of the deep water projects actually have potential for 250,000 barrels a day. Now, we don't see that in shallow water, but so that might even be a very conservative estimate on the loss. And remember, every barrel that we don't bring out of the Gulf of Mexico, we either bring it through the Suez Canal or somewhere else, and so that's why this hearing is important. If you haven't quantified about the moratorium and permitting, can you do that, or do you need the direction from the Department of Energy, or can you do it on your own request?
No, I mean, we can do that in part. I mean, again, it's difficult to ask the what-if question because one is looking back and, you need to look at particular drilling that and assume something about what would have occurred and what did occur and provide a comparison. As I mentioned, we do, in our short-term outlook, have about a 250,000 barrel per day decline in 2011 and another one in 2012, and a significant part of that would be due to the moratoria, but then also the the delay in permitting after that. To get it more fine-tuned than that would be a challenge.
Well, I know we have about a 10-month experience now, and again, like the testimony showed, we're not just talking about oil tomorrow or next month. We're talking about 2 to 3 to 5 years from now. That because if those permits continue, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your patience. Obviously, I have a lot of other questions, and I'd just like to submit them if we're not going to have a second round.
Thank you. Gentleman from Illinois, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing. Appreciate you all showing. A couple things. And it first directed to Mr. Hofmeister and Mr. Newell. And I don't know, Mr. Newell, if you've been asked, or many of us believe we could be energy independent. We all know that we're independent on electricity generation in this country. I talk about energy and the different types of use, electricity versus transportation fuel issues. Can we, based upon North American energy supplies, if we adequately access those, could we be energy independent? Mr. Hofmeister?
I think it would be very, very difficult to achieve full independence on the path that we are on. We would need to address the transportation industry somehow.
Well, and that makes a good point, and Mr. Markey left the room, but he keeps saying that in the hearing yesterday that we are going to turn back the clock on fuel economy standards, where the legislation drafted yesterday particularly protects those standards. It still allows NHTSA to perform the role in the 2012-2016 car rule. So we also believe that efficiency standards is part of an all-the-above energy strategy, and I think that's, if we did that, continue to move on energy security debate, all-the-above energy and efficiency standards, could we be?
Well, I think if you look over a 20 to 25-year roadmap, and if you substituted the internal combustion engine with other technology.
Well, in the all-the-above energy strategy, we also talk about expanding the nuclear portfolio.
Right.
So then you can have electricity meets, so I believe they have. Dr. Noel, have you done an analysis on North American energy and energy independence by accessing available resources?
We do track North American energy both statistically in terms of what's currently going on and also in our projections. We have not specifically addressed the question about what actions could one undertake in order to achieve energy independence. We have not looked at
Great, thank you. Let me follow up. I want to again highlight that in the legislation yesterday, and my colleague's coming back, I'll make sure he understands this, big political banners from last year was, read the bill. And I'll ask my colleague from Massachusetts, make sure he reads the bill, because we do not affect the 2012-2016 car rule and truck. We don't do it. So now I need to move to a couple other issues. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent that the Cambridge Energy Research Associates article on growth in the Canadian oil sands be placed into the record.
Without objection.
And also I have an article from AP Energy on North Dakota, and I'm going to use these in my comments.
Without objection.
Mr. Busch, with all due respect, I will invite you to come to my congressional district. Organized labor, where it thrives in the fossil fuel industry. We are expanding a big refinery, the ConocoPhillips refinery. We have several thousand members of organized labor, laborers, iron workers, operating engineers, carpenters, painters, been on site during this economy working in the fossil fuel industry. I would then point to Prairie State Generating Facility, which is a 1,600 megawatt plant where we've also had several thousand members of organized labor, the same construction workers, expanding and building this new state-of-the-art power plant. I mentioned that in my opening statement with the oil sands and what's in the testimony, I think 23,000 jobs that would then come, 23,000 would come on this one project alone for the state of Illinois. Energy security and jobs. We're focusing on jobs. For people to move, to destroy, and attack the fossil fuel industry when it is a major job creator, low-cost energy, that's what fires up a lot of us. I want to end with this story, which also talks about energy security. And really what we haven't addressed is the vast resources of natural gas in this country. That is a paradigm shift. And look what it's done to North Dakota and jobs. I know Speaker Pelosi once said natural gas is not a fossil fuel, but it is. Okay? Unemployment in North Dakota has fallen to the lowest level in the nation at 3.8%, less than half of the national rate of 9%. The influx, mostly male workers, to the region has left local men lamenting the lack of women. Convenience stores are struggling to keep shelves stocked with food. Why? They're accessing this new great resource, natural gas oil shales. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Ms. Capps, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm glad that my colleague is still here so that I can say that California, where we do have a strong labor movement, rejected the Koch brothers' attempt to remove all the clean air regulations that we have in California by voting down Proposition 23 in the last election. And I just want to address a few questions to you, Dr. Busch, because we also really support the Apollo Alliance as a jobs alliance in California. And I believe that we can look at renewable energy without being disparaging on any other form of energy and say this is a jobs opportunity for the future. We hear from the majority today that the way to reduce our dependence on foreign oil is to drill our way out of the problem. We know in California, but I think we know in our country that that's not true by a long shot. We use so much oil in this country. I actually think it's too precious to waste on energy because of the other products that oil can offer us, life-saving products. There's no way we could ever produce enough to meet our needs domestically. If we had adopted what many of us on this side of the dais and some on the other side as well had called for in the 1990s, like efficiency standards for our vehicles, homes, and appliances, we may not have found ourselves in the situation we are in today. Dr. Busch, the Republican majority, also claims that taking action to reduce carbon pollution would be too expensive. But that's not what you found when you looked at the demand side, and that's what I want to ask you about today. You and your colleagues examined the effects of California's clean energy law, which will lead to the adoption of more efficient vehicles and lower carbon fuels. California standards will reduce the amount of oil used by cars. Dr. Busch, what impact on oil demand and imports did California's measures have?
Well, we actually build on the analysis of the California Air Resources Board, and so using their numbers, we found that AB 32 policies would lead to a reduction of 75 million barrels per year. About an 18% reduction is the forecasted reduction.
And that's going to save California a little money? About how much?
Yeah, well, that's the AEO reference price annual energy outlook from the Department of Energy's EIA that we were working with, $114.50 per barrel. That's about $11 billion of a reduction in the import bill.
I hope that's being listened to by everyone here today. I think that's not pocket change. In your study, you examined an additional benefit of the clean car standards, the protection they offer from oil price shocks. Please tell us about that benefit.
Right. Well, we didn't actually separate the car standards, but the overall sort of protection under the price shock scenarios, and these were increases in gas or diesel of about 25% in the lower scenario and 50% in the higher scenario. So about $1 or a little more than $2 increase in gasoline. The price of gasoline reduces the saves consumers about $3 to $7 billion more, or roughly $200 to $500 if you would spread that over across households.
And that's not a partisan estimate. That's a study that's across the board, right?
Yes.
Okay. I know now you weren't here yesterday, but we had a hearing in our same subcommittee, received, I think, a quite compelling testimony from the EPA administrator when she testified that the American public and from the American Public Health Association witness that greenhouse gas emissions do threaten the public's health. Are there additional benefits to the public's health from oil reduction policy? And by that I want to extrapolate. It's important to save people's health not only for their well-being, but because healthy people make better working people and can actually help us to grow our economy. Can you please tell us some of the policies that will get us the most bang for the buck in terms of public health being an economic driver?
Well, I guess broadly speaking, in terms of economic drivers, I would point out California clean jobs have been growing about 3 times faster than jobs overall. In 2008, while overall jobs were shrinking, green jobs grew in California by 5%. In 2009, they grew 3%, while overall jobs grew 1%, so again about 3 times faster. And green manufacturing grew at a 10% rate in 2009. And 24% of green jobs are manufacturing jobs in California.
Absolutely.
Versus 11% of the overall employment. But on the health cost issue, I would say, the broader macroeconomic analyses haven't factored in the benefits to public health. In addition to the price spikes, insurance, and the national security implications. So, in California, the numbers I've seen, Cal State Fullerton study was $28 billion per year in health costs from the burning of fossil fuels in California. We don't burn much coal, so most of that would be on the transport side. So the big winners would be cleaning up transportation.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Burgess, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank the chairman. Mr. Hofmeister, I appreciated your thoughtful and well-prepared statement that you provided for us. You mentioned in there very briefly, and in this committee we had a lengthy hearing in the summer of 2008 when gasoline prices were so high. We had a lengthy hearing on the effects of speculation on driving the cost. And you mentioned that tangentially in your remarks, and while I realize that's not the principal source or the reason for this hearing today, can you expound upon that a little further, and do you have any information that you would like for this committee to consider going forward? Because it was an issue in the summer of 2008, I felt, though we never really came to a conclusion as an investigative body in the Oversight Committee on Energy and Commerce, and yet clearly before the worldwide economic downturn occurred, we were on a trajectory where the average person was going to be priced out of the retail gasoline market.
In my own investigation of the role of speculation, I conclude that it is a minor impact on overall crude oil price from the 2007-2008 period. The real issue that took place, and I testified to this in June of 2008 in my previous role, was the demand for middle distillates, that is diesel, aviation fuel, heating oil, where there was not enough crude oil barrels in the market to satisfy the demand for those middle distillates, drove the price to $147. In any commodity trading, there will always be some degree of speculation, from orange juice to pork bellies to coffee beans. True so also in oil. But based upon my own analysis, to get more than, say, 5% as speculated price, to me, is a real stretch. And it just is the reality of supply-demand. The supply-demand equation works extremely well across the world and also in this country. And the real issue is, the availability of crude oil or the insecurity about obtaining future contracts of crude oil. And that shortage of crude oil is what really drives price.
Well, and of course, as you correctly point out, the time horizon for new development, there's a 7 to 10 year lag between starting a project and actually having a deliverable in the marketplace. So I don't think there's any question, even though supply and demand during that hearing was discounted as a source of the problem. If there's a problem coming 7 years down the road and we don't deal with it today, if the problem today is speculation, but there's still going to be a supply-demand inequity in 7 years, it is obviously the producers need to be making the preparation and doing the investments necessary. And yet still, it was hard to separate out. I mean, I know that the head of Southwest Airlines makes money on the fact that he's able to hedge the fuel prices, and did that more effectively than any other airline in the country, and in 2008 profited handsomely from that. Yet there were other people who were buying large quantities who never intended to take delivery of that product, in fact, had no ability to take delivery, and it did seem that affected the overall price for the end user. Is there still work to be done on that? We're at a time now where I think even it was mentioned by the gentleman next to you that the price of crude does seem to track the stock market. It's a safe place for money to go right now, while other things seem not so safe. So is there still a role to play? Does Congress need to pay attention to this as a regulatory body?
Well, I think in the interest of consumers overall, the answer to your question is yes. I think there is an oversight role that needs to be played, because there can be manipulation. I didn't find it in the 2007-2008 period, and many of those who hedged in the summer of 2008 were burned badly later in the year when the price collapsed.
Yeah, we bailed them out, if you'll recall.
Right. But I think from an oversight...
I voted against that, just for the record, so everyone understands.
From an oversight standpoint, there is always a role, whether in any market, for the potential abuse that could exist. And those who don't own the product, I think, are the most likely to need to be watched over.
Let me just ask you quickly, because you also referenced some of the tight shale formation productions going on, and you're the only person on the panel who actually has any experience with production. I agree with you about that. In my area of North Texas, in the Barnett Shale, it's a big deal. But there is also concern, and the general public in the area is not convinced that they are being protected from air quality issues, water quality issues. There's a big fight going on between federal regulators and state regulators back where I live. There seems like there is a lot of responsibility that has to fall on the producers, and I would think that the producers would be more proactive about ensuring that things are done properly so that they don't lose this very precious resource because of pushback by the general public.
There's a very serious effort underway by a number of producers to try to arrive at appropriate standards, because you're absolutely right. When people operate below standard or do not operate to best practice, best in class, then abuses can take place and people do suffer. So between a number of associations and a number of major companies, there is an effort to agree upon what should those standards be, and then find a way to get people to comply with such standards.
Committee, if you have some of that information.
Mr. Scalise, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you hosting this hearing dealing with the Middle Eastern crisis and especially how it relates to U.S. energy markets. I want to walk back a little bit and first go through some of the things that got us to the situation we're in the Gulf of Mexico, which Congressman John did a really good job of outlining. Right after the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon, the President commissioned a team of scientists and commissioned them to go out and come back with a safety report, a report on not only what went wrong as much as how we can improve safety in the Gulf operations. And there was a 30-day safety report that was put together that the Department of Interior issued that was peer-reviewed by scientists. And there were some good recommendations on how to improve safety, many things that most of the companies, unlike BP, were already doing. The problem that came out of this was the document that was referenced to create the moratorium. And I want to submit this for the record. I ask unanimous consent that we can submit
Without
the
objection.
report. We later found out that this document was fraudulently doctored by the Obama administration to suggest that the scientists themselves recommended the moratorium. And I think it's really important for everybody to understand that the moratorium that came out, that 2 courts now have said the administration doesn't even have the legal authority to administer, that moratorium was based on fraudulent doctoring of this document. And in fact, the scientists, a majority of those scientists that were peer reviewing the document that the President himself appointed, that were appointed by the White House, a majority of those scientists said they not only disagreed with the moratorium, but they point out how the moratorium reduces safety of drilling operations in the Gulf of Mexico. And they have some very sound reasons why that moratorium reduces safety in the Gulf and why they disagreed with it, even though their name was attached to it. Of course, the Obama administration later had to apologize to these scientists for that fraudulent doctoring. And that's never really covered thoroughly enough, and I think it's something we do need to pursue, but I want to ask unanimous consent to also include this in the record, because I think it's important to establish that the moratorium itself came from fraudulent activities by the Obama administration, which now has brought us to the point of the permitorium, as was described, where they are not issuing permits in the Gulf today for any drilling activities in the deep water, which dramatically is reducing America's energy security, and I think is one of the contributing factors to why we're over 90, approaching $100 a barrel on the price of oil in the spot market. So I want to ask Congressman John, because you work directly with these companies, and you talked a little bit about it in your opening statement, the things that you're seeing on the ground. I know I hear from people every day, not just the people who are exploring for energy, but all of the service industry people, all of the ancillary. We've gotten reports from the White House alone that 12,000 jobs have already been lost in South Louisiana. Not even getting into the rest of the country. In South Louisiana, we've lost 12,000 jobs because of the moratorium, now the permitorium that's going on. So if you can tell me if you've got any more numbers on how much wider that is approaching, because there's so many companies that are just literally holding on by a vine. Companies that are small businesses, local American businesses that are about to go under, about to go bankrupt because of the administration's fraudulent activity. I'm not sure if your microphone's on.
Sorry about that. As far as the direct jobs, and again, there are a lot of numbers out there, Congressman Scalise, but we try to put our arms around the realistic of what's happening out there, and the math is pretty easy to do. When you look at the jobs that are lost today, there are these 6 drill ships that are gone. They're gone. And if you multiply those numbers out, it's right in the 5,000 to 6,000 direct jobs. And then you have to multiply that times 4 because according to a study that was commissioned by Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas by Dr. Lawrence Scott, it's a multiplier of 4. So, yes, is there some debatableness about
but it's
the numbers?
well in the thousands, maybe approaching
well
tens of
over
thousands.
10,000 jobs that have been lost as of today. And G&O Inc. Predicted that Woods Mackenzie study said that a permanent moratorium, or a moratorium that lasts for longer than a year or so, and with a total shutdown of the Gulf, it's 175,000 jobs that
Appreciate
are related.
that. And I know we've got a list here of the rigs, as you talked about the 33, and these are very valuable assets, $1 billion asset each in many cases, that have already left. I'll tell you some of the countries that some of these assets have gone to. Libya, Nigeria, Congo. 2 of them have actually gone to Egypt. And it is a sad state of affairs in this country when a major employer thinks that it's better to do business in Egypt than it is in the United States because of the Obama administration's policies that are leading us to a higher dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Egypt, 2 of these assets have gone to, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit this into the record as well. And I thank you for being here and for what all you're doing, and I yield back the balance.
Without objection. I might also say that toward the end of the year, we sent a letter to Michael Bromwich asking for some response to questions regarding the moratorium. We never heard anything from him. We're getting ready to recontact him a little bit more forcefully this time, and hopefully we can get some additional answers. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, the witnesses, for coming today to give us your expertise on this critically important matter. And I'd like to ask my first question to Mr. Hofmeister. First of all, thank you, sir, for your service to my hometown of Houston. Greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate that. And I want to talk about national security and the Middle East. I think you believe, as I do, that we have to develop all the oil and gas resources that God's given our country. You know, that means the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, the West Coast, Alaska, the public lands, wherever it is, we need to develop that oil. We're very vulnerable today, geographically, particularly. I mean, with these straits of Hormuz and with the Suez Canal, where most of the oil that our country depends upon flows through. And I was in the Navy for about 10 years, flew P-3s, and did many, many patrols through the Straits of Hormuz. And it is a very, very, very narrow choke point, about 10, 15 miles wide at its widest. And when we flew through there, we had devices on our aircraft that we were being tracked by fire control radar from the Iranians. And I can guarantee you that they're doing that with not near a target than an airplane, with the tankers that are coming through. I mean, if they want to cause big, big trouble for the world, take out a tanker right there in the middle of the Straits and cut off the whole Persian Gulf to traffic. And so, my point here is, we're depending right now. I've got 2 very unstable nations. I mean, Egypt, with what's going on there internally, and Iran with a leadership who doesn't live on this planet. And I know you predicted $5 a gallon, maybe by gasoline by the end of this year. If some of these things happen in the Middle East that I'm concerned about, if Iran does something to the Straits of Hormuz or Egypt shuts down the Suez Canal, how would that impact your prediction of $5 per year gallon of gasoline?
The Straits of Hormuz watch about 20 to 25% of the world's daily crude oil production move through it. And if the world were to lose that amount of oil because of a shutdown in the Straits, I think that the immediate impact on crude oil prices would be to not just double but even triple the current crude oil price because of the panic that would set in terms of future contracting. There might be a slight delay to see how long it might take to clean up the mess that might be created there. But it is such a critical pinch point, and there is so much of that oil that goes both east and west that it's not only energy security for the United States, it's energy security for the world's second largest economy, China. And so the consequence would be dramatic. $5 would look cheap in terms of a gasoline price in the event of the Straits of Hormuz being shut in.
Thank you for that rather sobering answer. And one question for you, Congressman John. Thank you also for your service. And as you know, we've been talking about it. We've had a moratorium, now a permatorium, in the deep water in the Gulf since April of last year. And I've known of at least 5 rigs that have gone overseas that my colleague, Mr. Scalise, mentioned. Amazingly, most of the rigs that I've talked to are taken on the chin at about $500,000 a day, just sitting idle. But most of them are still staying here in our country in these waters because they believe we have the best sort of regulatory system, judicial system, and they want to, they believe it's less risk to them long term than some of them going overseas. I think the president missed an opportunity during his State of the Union when he could have at least mentioned the oil spill and what he's done to lift the moratorium and make a commitment to get the rigs, the permitting out going, and get those rigs back out there working. And unfortunately, 2 days after the president's speech, we had one more rig announce that they're going to go overseas. And it was one of the Noble Corp's rigs, the Clyde Boudreaux, and they announced that they're going to take their rig, hope I pronounced that right, not from Louisiana, but they were going to take their rig to Brazil. And this is the quote that just sticks out with me about the impact of this moratorium, this permatorium on our oil supply. One of the Nobel employees was quoted as saying, "There is life after the Gulf of Mexico, and that would be Brazil." Is there a tipping point, Congressman, where somewhere we're going to be hearing not just that there's life after the Gulf of Mexico, life is in Brazil, life is in the Sudan, life is in Nigeria, life is in Norway, wherever. Life is somewhere else, not American waters, and we're going to lose those American jobs permanently and more dependent upon foreign oil.
Well, I guess I can only answer your question is picture yourself in a boardroom where you may have $4 or $5 or $6 billion in your cap budget for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. Where would you as a board member want to decide to put those kinds of dollars? Is it in the Gulf where today there's an enormous amount of uncertainty today, or is it somewhere else? And I mean, that's the only way really I can answer that question. I think that the fact that 7 rigs, 6 have gone and a brand new one is leaving, I think is the initial signal of what's to come, because there is a tipping point. And I think we are very, very close to that point because of the fact that industry and the Bureau of Energy Management have worked together to come up with safety regulations, task force that the industries have put together. The Marine Well Containment Company, $1 billion commitment by 4 companies and more adding today to put $1 billion into a company for containment. So we have done, I think the industry has done an enormous amount, a good job of all the regulations and doing what is required of them to get back, and the goalpost keeps moving. And I think that is very troubling in a lot of rigs, and you only have to look at the amount of money that is being invested out there to give you an idea of where else could it go, and there are a lot of other places that it could go.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Chairman, I ask you to consent the article from the Houston Chronicle about the ship going over to Brazil.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Mr. McKinley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I left the private sector. I was architectural engineering practice to get back into the political arena, because I had a fundamental belief that our national security and our welfare of our country has been at risk with us not having an energy policy and being independent from foreign oil. I think it's something we've talked about. What this hearing was supposed to be about is the concept of what's happened over in the Middle East. I don't think it's going to end with Egypt. It's going to continue. And I'm here, have come to Congress because I want to deal with energy independence. But yet I've come here, and now I've come to the realization when I look across the aisle and I hear the remarks in some of the people in the policy, one place that we're not short of here is naivete. It's rampant in this community. And I'm very concerned about where we're going. This idea of alternate travel, driving. Look, West Virginia is a very rural, mountainous area. The largest community I have in my district has 35,000 people in it. The idea of high-speed rail and other time isn't going to work. Well, what I'm looking for here when I've come is to find ways that we can become energy independent, and that's to mine coal. That's to mine and drill into the Marcellus Shale and the oil and gas that we've had in West Virginia. But all I've heard for the last several years has been to stop this dagger in the heart of West Virginia, the cap and trade, fly ash challenges, water discharge, greenhouse gas emissions, the revocation of mine permits. It's as though Congress really doesn't want to have us independent. We know how to do it. I'm sure there are panels like this elsewhere that are saying we can do that. We can be energy independent, but we're just not. So I want to hear just the discussion we had yesterday. Mr. Hofmeister, you stressed jobs in your opening remark. I am so frustrated we have 15 million people out of work in America. Union, non-union, Americans out of work. I want to try to do something in mining coal and making us energy independent will get us that direction. My question to you, do you think denying the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases is a responsible means to reduce our dependence on foreign oil?
In my judgment, Congressman, I believe that the Environmental Protection Agency is going way too far, too fast, without the means, the mechanisms, or the technology available to change the game the way they're trying to change the game. I visited Pike County, Kentucky before Christmas just to see what's going on in the coal region of eastern Kentucky. And what I learned from operators in eastern Kentucky is they haven't had a new mine permit in years because they can't get past EPA regulations on water quality. And the water quality that they are expected to reach has to have Evian bottled water consistency coming down a stream in a natural forest. It doesn't exist in nature, Mr. Congressman, and I think there is a reach going on that is job destructive and that doesn't take into account the fact that over the coming decades, I believe the ingenuity and the innovation that's possible in the hydrocarbon world can dramatically clean up the use of hydrocarbons so that we can continue to use natural resources found in this country.
Dr. Newell, can we be energy independent if we mine coal and let us drill? And if so, why aren't we doing it? So that we can be energy independent.
I mean, currently coal goes almost exclusively 90-something% for electricity.
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Coal goes primarily almost exclusively for electricity generation, which is the vast majority of which is already domestically produced. So the main issue with regard to fuel imports relates to petroleum. We've currently got about 50% of our liquids consumption comes from imported petroleum. So there are, certainly actions that would tend to affect that. Lower consumption and higher domestic production tend to squeeze out imports, but we currently have about 9 million barrels per day. We are projecting that's downward trend.
The question is, can we be independent if we mine our coal and drill for our gas in America?
It would be a matter of primarily domestic liquids production that would change the oil import picture, and it would be a significant change from where we currently are.
So the answer is yes.
Do you want to respond to that, Mr. Newell?
The answer would depend upon the actions that were taken. On current market trends, that is not where things are currently headed.
Mr. Gardner, are you recognized for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you as well for this timely hearing. I certainly appreciate your efforts to do this today. And thank you to the members of the panel for taking time away from work to be here. Appreciate your time. Dr. Newell, I'll start with you, going back to you to talk a little bit about some of the testimony. In your testimony, you talked about some of the cost impacts on a per barrel basis of energy disruption out of the Middle East and some other issues that we face should something continue to disrupt energy supplies in the Middle East. What would the overall, in terms of economic impact, the overall economic impact be should an incident close the Suez Canal to transport? Should an incident close some of the checkpoints that we're talking about here, whether it's the Gulf of Aden to the Red Sea off of Yemen, whether it's the Suez Canal? If those were to close, what would in real dollars, what would that impact be to our economy?
The impact would depend upon any price effect of some type of an international disruption. What would tend to happen in terms of oil price increases tends to decrease the amount of household disposable income that can go to other things. It tends to act like an additional cost on production, and if you cost more to have one major input into our national production, it would tend to lead to a decline in GDP. A rough rule of thumb is that every $10 per barrel increase of the price of oil might shave roughly 0.2% off of GDP over the next year. It depends upon the nature of any kind of a price shock that would occur. If it's a supply-side price shock, it would tend to have the kind of effects that I said. It would also depend whether it's temporary or permanent. A permanent increase is obviously more damaging. If it's an increase that's caused from demand increases like faster global economic growth, it's a less negative impact because along with global economic growth goes increased demand for U.S. products, and so that tends to offset any effect. So it depends.
So is there any way to get a number in terms of if this were to happen, if these two cases were to happen, if there was a disruption, total disruption as a result in the Suez Canal, what it would cost? I mean, what would that number be? $1 billion, $2 billion? I know you said 0.2 shaving off the GDP, but what would that number be?
It really would depend on the specific scenario. So closing different transit points doesn't necessarily take production off of the market. And so if you can reroute that production through other transit points, there may be a short-term impact, but once things adjust, it would tend to bring it back down. It would depend on the magnitude of any kind of a production shortfall. It would depend upon the response of remaining supply sources. So, for example, if one country had a decline in production, there's significant spare crude oil production capacity in other countries that could offset it. There's also strategic petroleum reserves that could offset certain impacts. So I'm not trying to evade the question, but it really depends on a very specific scenario and the responses that one imagines to that scenario.
Well, thank you. Mr. Szymanski, just a broader question. Based on our energy policy in the United States today, are we becoming more or less globally competitive in the U.S.?
Well, Mr. Gardner, and I think everybody in the room, since I was the only one that said no to Congressman Markey's question, I now get a chance to explain. I wish he were here. In fact, when I testified before Mr. Markey a couple of years ago, and what I said was the most troubling thing I find about hearings like this is what seems to an outsider to be a unappreciation for the fact that these solutions are not mutually exclusive, that getting more oil in the Gulf of Mexico or not having a moratorium is not mutually exclusive to fuel efficiency standards for automobiles. I serve on the National Petroleum Council. Several years ago, we did a study that was widely well received that basically said there is no single solution to our energy policy problem, that we need to do all those things that make economic sense on the supply side and the demand side in order to move forward. And so let's come back to the Middle East thing. I keep hearing virtually everybody in this room saying, well, we've got to reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern oil. That makes sense if it's good economics and good foreign policy. I'm not so sure that it is. Right. Unless we can produce the oil here less expensively, it would reduce jobs here in this country to say, well, we're just not going to import oil from the Middle East.
So in 10 seconds, are we more or less competitive as a result of current U.S. energy policy?
I would say that current U.S. energy policy is probably not doing a whole lot either way to our dependence on the Middle East.
We're less competitive?
Are we less competitive? We would be more competitive. We'd be more competitive if we did not exclude development of domestic resources for what it seems to me to be poor policy reasons.
In my view, we are far less competitive as a nation by virtue of not producing domestic resources, which I believe are eminently affordable to produce.
Mr. Pompeo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here this morning. Mr. Hofmeister, you mentioned Matt Simmons early on, and it reminded me, Doctor, in your analysis, there's his theory of peak oil theory. What's the assumption that you all have made? I don't want to get into the complexities of that, but what's the assumption you've made with respect to total capacity and the ability to get at that?
Well, we are projecting an increase in both U.S. domestic production of crude oil over the next 25 years, as well as a significant increase internationally in crude oil. So we, at this point in time, for the next 25 years, which is how far our projection goes out, we don't see a peaking of world oil production capacity.
I appreciate that. And did you also assume, you gave some pricing for the next several decades for what you were forecasting for pricing, did you continue to assume that oil would be priced in dollars, that commodity would largely be continue to be trading in the U.S. dollar?
It's not something we explicitly assume. I mean, that is certainly the way that we track it through our model. If that were to change, I don't think that would significantly change the outlook if you priced it in some other way.
I mentioned, I think some of Mr. Sheminsky's folks would be very concerned if we decided to price oil in a different way. I know that I certainly would, too. So would the folks in Kansas who are producing oil. I sit here today. 40 days ago, I was running a company that was a member of Cuyahoga, the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Industry, and so there are national security implications and cost implications for consumers, too, in terms of how we price oil in the marketplace. I don't think anybody's talked this morning either about refining capacity in America, and I think that's important. We focused on getting the crude here. Mr. Hofmeister or Mr. Jones, could you speak to me, too, about we have a huge problem getting refineries built in the United States today. We can talk about how long it's been since there's been one. I see that as a huge component when it comes to gasoline prices in addition to the crude oil inputs.
Yeah, I'd be glad to comment. Actually, in my written testimony, I have a whole paragraph that I didn't talk about refining capacity, because you really can't talk about crude oil and oil production and how it all fits into the puzzle of energy policy without talking about refinery, because a barrel of oil without a refinery is just a barrel of oil. You must be able to boil that oil to get the value added out of it. And I guess the most alarming part of our refining capacity is we haven't built a grassroots from the grass up in almost 30 years. In fact, the opening and the expansion of the Garyville refinery, the Marathon Garyville refinery down in Louisiana, was as close as it's going to get to a new refinery in this country. It just hasn't happened for a myriad of reasons. But I think that the fact of the location of all the refining capacity in this country should be of some concern. Not only are we vulnerable from the importation of oil from countries that don't share our values, but it doesn't take long to look at in 2008 when Hurricane Gustav and Hurricane Ike came through the Gulf of Mexico, and the refining capacity from Corpus Christi, Texas, to Pascagoula, Mississippi, is 50% of this nation. And every one of those refineries at some point in time during those 2.5 weeks of those two hurricanes were either shut down, cold, or warmed. And what the implications were that was that the lines up in the Northeast, because all of the refined products and the gasoline that is used in Chattanooga and Atlanta and in Alabama and in Mississippi come from the Gulf Coast. And if you remember correctly, there were lines waiting on where is our gasoline, and it was because of that. And that just shows the vulnerability that we've had. We need some more refining capacity. However, I think it's important that we must get the crude oil into the pipelines to be able to actually refine and value add that.
Mr. Hofmeister, do you care to comment? Or
I think that's been well said.
Okay.
There have been a few additions to existing refineries, but only in recent years.
One last question. Mr. Busch, you said, and I think I got this right, you said there were green jobs created while the overall jobs decreased. Do you think those could be related? And here's my point. When you create rules and regulations that cause folks to go try and create these jobs where government regulation would not have permitted them to be before, when federal policy encourages these green jobs, that you do, in fact, destroy the economy. So you see green jobs growing while overall jobs are decreasing. You think those are disconnected thoughts?
I don't believe they're related, no. I mean, the trend has been continuing for a long period, so I don't.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Griffith, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Newell, if you would, I noticed, or answering one of the earlier questions, you were able to project or had at least some ideas of what oil production was going to do in the United States. Can you tell me what coal production is going to do in the United States between now and 2025?
We do have the projections for that. I don't have the specific numbers in front of me right now. Most of this depends largely on outlook for coal-based electricity generation. It also depends somewhat on what your starting point is. We've seen during the economic downturn over the last several years, and also a significant decline in natural gas prices. Over the last several years, there's been a significant decline in the demand for coal for electric power generation. We do.
If I could stop you there and ask you, do you believe that the reason for the significant downturn in demand for coal for electric generation is due to federal regulations on coal and the use of it in the electric generation?
Not at this point. I actually don't think so. There's the main factors that have led to a decline in coal over the last several years are the economic downturn, which had an effect on overall electricity generation, and a very significant decline in natural gas prices as well. And so I think that would be the main factor. Looking forward, obviously regulations would tend to have an impact if they would focus on coal.
How many electric generation facilities have switched from coal to natural gas?
So there's been I have an answer to your question here.
Thank you.
2009 coal production was 1,075 million metric tons, and it goes up to 1,315 million metric tons by the end of our projection, so it increases. Now, largely this is in existing electric power plants, which we project most of those would continue to stay online under existing laws and regulations. I don't know if I answered the other part of your question, though. Which
Go ahead.
What
no, you want me to rephrase?
Sorry.
I'm going to switch gears on you anyway.
Okay.
I note with some interest that in getting prepared for today, since we are supposed to be focused on Egypt, but I don't have much oil in my district, got a lot of coal and got a lot of natural gas. But I did notice with some interest that apparently we imported 442 short tons, not a lot, of coal from Egypt during the last year. And I'm wondering if you could tell me what was special about that coal. It must have been somebody needed something particular. You have any clue?
I really don't, but it's something we can find out for you.
If you can get me an answer later, I did not expect you to have that at the top of your, on the tip of your tongue. If I could shift now to Dr. Busch, you got into a discussion earlier about health, and we have concerns in my area. Electric rates have gone up significantly, and I would have to say that since the previous questioner asked you questions about public policy and health concerns, I don't think there's any question that if we regulate the way that the EPA wants to on greenhouse gases, it's going to cause even more spikes in electricity or fuel for the people in my district who already are facing difficulties with the median income for the household of about $35,000. Would you not agree that if we have a significant increase in the cost of the ability to heat your home through electricity powered by coal or from home heating fuel, that we are going to be affecting adversely, particularly during the winter months, the health of the people who are having a hard time affording it right now, affording the energy sources to provide heat in their homes currently?
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. I would say certainly agree that affordable energy to keep a home warm in the winter and cool in the summer for places that have high heat spikes, that's important to health. I wouldn't have an opinion on whether increases in energy costs would be more detrimental than reductions in pollutants that might be released from electricity generation. I don't know which would be more.
You don't know?
I don't know.
Okay. But it's something that should be considered by the agency as agencies of the United States government as they go forward in determining our policies on greenhouse gases. Would you not agree?
I agree it's important to consider all the trade-offs amongst the options, yes.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my 10 seconds.
Thank you very much. Do any of you have any one additional question you'd like to ask? You would just a minute. You have one.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you for being so kind. I want to go back to Mr. Hofstadter. Mr. Hofstadter, I'm really kind of intrigued by your opening statement, and you know, I'm in a district where my constituents are probably suffer from ill effects of environmental ill effects, asthma, all other kind of illnesses, diseases that might occur. But they also, it's the, you know, we don't have a lot of oil or no oil in my district, but we got high unemployment. That is really one of the characteristics of my district. And you mentioned in your opening statement about job creation. You know, can you elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of what you really mean by job creation? Because that intrigues me.
Thank you, Ranking Member Rush. If we look at a significant commitment by this country to increasing its domestic oil production, could include gas, could include power plant construction. The number of jobs that would be created through the capital investment made necessary to produce this additional oil would, in effect, I believe, raise jobs all over the country, not just in the oil patch. The reason is the distributed manufacturing system that supplies oil companies includes companies that make equipment in places like Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan. Many North Great Lakes states are producing the kind of skilled metalworking crafts that are necessary. The steel industry makes pipe. The automotive industry makes the trucks and many other components that go into oil rigs and offshore platforms. And so the equipment manufacturing is a big part of it. In addition, there's a whole services industry that comes with it. And there's an education industry that comes with it because so many skills would need to be trained in community college systems and in four-year schools. And it would encourage high school students to stay in school to go to community college to get the skills. The average wage we're talking about in the oil and gas industry for semi-skilled workers is in the $60,000 to $80,000 a year, which is almost double the median wage in the country. And so these high-wage jobs enable people to buy many more things, and that's why I say it's a tide that lifts all ships.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to, on behalf of the ranking member, Mr. Waxman, I will ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record a report prepared by the NRDC on concerns with tar sands.
Yeah, well, I reluctantly won't object to that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Scalise, you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity. Just, I guess I'll ask the whole panel a yes or no question. With this administration's current policy of not issuing permits in the Gulf of Mexico for now 10 months, not allowing people to go back to work drilling safely in the Gulf of Mexico, is that 10-month and potentially longer refusal to issue any new permits on deepwater drilling, is that going to increase or decrease our country's dependence on foreign oil? Start with you, Mr. Newell.
I'm going to have to decline to take a policy position on this.
Okay. Or just a judgment. I mean, this isn't there was a policy decision made, but its impact, how is that policy's impact going to be on our nation's dependence on foreign oil? Would it increase or decrease? And if you don't want to answer, I respect that. Okay. Mr. Moore.
Sir, as a representative of a foreign government, I cannot opine on that matter.
I think it's a huge mistake to not develop the resources in the Gulf of Mexico, and unnecessary delays in permitting are a mistake. I don't think that has I don't think that carrying that to the next step of your question is particularly important. Whether that does anything to our use of Middle Eastern oil, I don't think is really critical. Just very quickly, 10 seconds on this. Saudi Arabia was brought up in this hearing. If it weren't for the fact that Saudi Arabia has 3 or 4 million barrels a day of spare capacity that's available in the marketplace, or if it weren't for the fact that we have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve both here and elsewhere around the world, we would be in a lot worse shape with problems in the Suez Canal or anywhere else in the Middle East.
Right, but there's been no suggestion to tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that I've heard. I'm not sure if you've heard anything different.
Well, you would do it if there was a problem.
Right, but if our demand, and maybe you think our demand might be decreasing, but if our demand is going to remain the same or increase, and yet our actual access to known sources of reserves is shut off by policy, you don't think that would cause an increase in the need for it to come from someplace else?
Well, we might just get more oil from Canada, which...
Well, but I mean, that's why I said foreign oil, and I would
really
include
like.
Canada in that. I would sure like to completely eliminate our country's dependence on Middle Eastern oil, and I think if we invoked a real smart strategy, we absolutely could eliminate our dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Canada's a good friend and a trading partner, but clearly we're still getting, as he pointed out, over 20% of our oil.
What we want to
from those Middle
eliminate
Eastern
our
countries.
dependence on is uneconomic oil. Whether it comes from the Middle East or somewhere else is not the question.
Right, but would it increase or decrease based on a shutting off of the supply that we currently know is there?
If without that domestic oil, we're going to need more oil from somewhere, and it could be coming from the Middle East.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hofmeister.
It's a very serious problem in both the short and the long term, and yes, it would require greater dependence on foreign sources.
Thank you.
I don't have a great amount of expertise in this area, but I'm happy to offer my opinions if you'd like.
Sure.
It seems, from what I know, it takes a while to get a new well online, so I would imagine in the short run it wouldn't make much of a difference, but all else equal, it seems obvious to me if we're providing more domestically and we're not changing demand, that there would be less dependence on imported oil.
Thank you. And Mr. John?
I think Congressman Scalise, from a logical economic standpoint, the answer to your question is absolutely it would make us more dependent on foreign sources. However, with the assumption of 1.5 million barrels that come out of the Gulf of Mexico, can we do without that? The question is, can we reduce our demand by 1.5 million right now? Then the answer to the question would be no. I think I know the answer to that question.
I haven't seen that demand reduce, and I appreciate it, and I'll just end on this final thought. I know there are provisions in current leases that are use it or lose it provisions, and as this permatorium is going on, the clock is still ticking on those leases. So there are many employers out there in the Gulf of Mexico who have leases who want to use it and are not even being allowed to use it by the federal government in a safe way, and yet the clock is still ticking even though they're not being allowed to go and extricate those resources. And when you look at what's happening in Egypt and even in other parts, as you pointed out, the supertanker that was hijacked by Somali pirates in the Arabian Sea right off of Oman, there are major threats out there to supply chains, notwithstanding Canada, but there are major supplies, especially in the Middle East, and increased volatility, and yet you've got a policy that shut off those reserves in the Gulf of Mexico. And with the use it or lose it provisions, this is a point that's never really been explored. If that clock keeps ticking and those people aren't allowed to go and explore those resources, if that lease runs out, the government could take those leases back and not leave them out on the open market, so you're now even closing off more known reserves. There are few areas of the OCS that are currently available to explore. You would actually be pulling back. As a policy, the country would be pulling back even more of the very few reserves that are already out there available for exploration. And I don't know if you want to finish on that and if there's even time.
Just a quick comment there, Congressman Solis. Since 2008, $8 billion has been spent by oil and gas companies leasing up the Gulf of Mexico. The highest and the second highest lease sale in the history of the Gulf of Mexico happened in 2009. So you've got an enormous amount of capital in leasing this 3-by-3 square mile of water for a 5-year period of time. So I think your point's well taken.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity.
Dr. Newell, I just have one question for you. In your levelized cost analysis of electricity, why does the EIA add the equivalent of $15 per ton carbon tax in the determination of the cost of the new plants?
Yes, what we do is to reflect existing market behavior of investors and how they're perceiving investment in new coal generation capacity. What we do is we have a roughly 3% additional capital to the capital cost in terms of financing, and this is to reflect behavior that we see in the marketplace in terms of interest on the part of investors in new electricity generation capacity from coal, which is being colored by any number of things, including the possibility of future regulations that would affect coal generation. Okay. So that's what that's meant to do, to reflect market behavior with regard to coal-intensive technologies.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. Yeah, Mr. Maher.
Mr. Chairman, may I supplement an answer in response to Congressman Upton's earlier question about pipelines going to the West Coast from Alberta?
Sure.
The proposed Gateway pipeline would have the capacity to take 525,000 barrels a day from Alberta to the West Coast. A proposal for rail by pipeline, oil by rail has the capacity to take an additional 200,000 barrels a day. And the currently existing Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline has current capacity of 300,000 barrels per day, which would be a total of just over 1 million barrels a day total. There is currently also a proposal to expand the Kinder Morgan pipeline, so that gives you some sense of the volumes that could be moved to the West Coast.
Well, thank you very much, and once again, appreciate your testimony. We look forward to continuing working with you. We'll keep the record open. Members have 10 days to submit additional material, and the record will be open for 30 days. And with that, we'll conclude this hearing. Thank you.